History of the Communist Party. Of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks. From Marx to Mao. M. L. Copyright Digital Reprints 2006. Introduction 1. Chapter 1. The Struggle for the Creation of a Social Democratic Labor Party in Russia. 188319001. 1. Abolition of serfdom and the development of industrial capitalism in Russia. Rise of the modern industrial proletariat. First steps of the working class movement. 2. Narodism, populism, and Marxism in Russia. Plekhanov and his Emancipation of Labor group. Plekhanov's fight against Narodism. Spread of Marxism in Russia. 3. Beginning of Lenin's revolutionary activities. St. Petersburg. League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. 4. Lenin's struggle against Narodism and legal Marxism. Lenin's idea of an alliance of the working class and the peasantry. First Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. 5. Lenin's fight against economism. Appearance of Lenin's newspaper Iskra. Brief summary. Chapter 2. Formation of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Appearance of the Bolshevik and the Menshevik groups within the party. 190-11904. 1. Upsurge of the revolutionary movement in Russia in 1901042. Lenin's plan for the building of a Marxist party. Opportunism of the economists. Iskra's fight for Lenin's plan. Lenin's book What is to be Done. Ideological foundations of the Marxist Party. From Marx to Mao. Not for commercial distribution. 3. Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Adoption of program and rules and formation of a single party. Differences at the Congress and appearance of two trends within the party, the Bolshevik and the Menshevik. 4. Splitting activities of the Menshevik leaders and sharpening of the struggle within the party after the Second Congress. Opportunism of the Menshevik. Lenin's book, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. Organizational principles of the Marxist Party. Brief summary. Chapter 3. The Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks in the period of the Russo-Japanese War and the First Russian Revolution. 190419007. 1. Russo-Japanese War. Further rise of the revolutionary movement in Russia. Strikes in St. Petersburg. Workers' demonstration before the Winter Palace on January 9, 1905. Demonstration fired upon. Outbreak of the Revolution. 2. Workers' political strikes and demonstrations. Growth of the revolutionary movement among the peasants. Revolt on the battleship Potemkin. 3. Tactical differences between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. 3rd Party Congress. Lenin's two tactics of social democracy in the democratic revolution. Tactical foundations of the Marxist Party. 4. Further rise of the revolution. All-Russian political strike of October 1905. Retreat of Tsardom. The Tsar's Manifesto. Rise of the Soviets of Workers' Deputies. 5. December Armed Uprising. Defeat of the uprising. Retreat of the revolution. First State Duma. 4th Unity Party Congress. 6. Dispersion of the First State Duma. Convocation of the Second State Duma. 5th Party Congress. Dispersion of the Second State Duma. Causes of the defeat of the First Russian Revolution. Brief summary. Chapter 4. The Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks in the period of the Stolypin reaction. The Bolsheviks constitute themselves an independent Marxist party. 190-81912. 1. Stolypin reaction. Disintegration among the oppositional intelligentsia. Decadence. Desertion of a section of the party intelligentsia to the enemies of Marxism and attempts to revise the theory of Marxism. Lenin's rebuttal of the Revi-Sionists in his materialism and empirio-criticism and his defense of the theoretical foundations of the Marxist Party. 2. Dialectical and historical materialism. 3. Bolsheviks and Mensheviks in the period of the Stolypin reaction. Struggle of the Bolsheviks against the liquidators and Otzevists. 4. Struggle of the Bolsheviks against Trotskyism. Anti-party. August Block 5. Prague Party Conference, 1912. Bolsheviks constitute themselves an independent Marxist party. Brief summary. Chapter 5. The Bolshevik Party during the new rise of the WORKINGCLASS movement before the First Imperialist War. 191219114. 1. Rise of the revolutionary movement in the period 1912142. The Bolshevik newspaper Pravda. The Bolshevik group in the 4th State Duma. 3. Victory of the Bolsheviks in the legally existing organizations. Continued rise of the revolutionary movement. Eve of the imperialist war. Brief summary. Chapter 6. The Bolshevik Party in the period of the imperialist war. The Second Revolution in Russia. 1914 March 1917. 1. Outbreak and causes of the imperialist war. 2. From Marx to Mao. Not 4. Commercial distribution IA list governments. Disintegration of the Second International into separate chauvinist parties. 3. Theory and tactics of the Bolshevik Party on the question of war, peace and revolution. 4. Defeat of the Tsarist army, economic disruption, crisis of Tsardom. 5. The February Revolution, fall of Tsardom, formation of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, formation of the Provisional Government, dual power. Brief summary. Chapter 7. The Bolshevik Party in the period of preparation and realization of the October Socialist Revolution, April 1-9, 1-7-1-9-1-8. 1. Situation in the country after the February Revolution. Party emerges from underground and passes to open political work. Lenin arrives in Petrograd. Lenin's April theses. Party's policy of transition to socialist revolution. 2. Beginning of the crisis of the Provisional Government, April. Conference of the Bolshevik Party. 3. Successes of the Bolshevik Party in the capital. Abortive offensive of the armies of the Provisional Government. Suppression of the July demonstration of workers and soldiers. 4. The Bolshevik Party adopts the course of preparing for armed uprising. 6th Party Congress. 5. General Kornilov's plot against the revolution. Suppression of the plot. Petrograd and Moscow Soviets go over to the Bolsheviks. 6. October uprising in Petrograd and arrest of the Provisional Government. Second Congress of Soviets and formation of the Soviet Government. Decrees of the Second Congress of Soviets on Peace and Land. Victory of the Socialist Revolution. Reasons for the victory of the Socialist Revolution. 7. Struggle of the Bolshevik Party to consolidate the Soviet power. Peace of Brest-Litovsk, 7th Party Congress. 8. Lenin's plan for the initial steps in socialist construction. Committees of the poor peasants and the curbing of the kulaks. Revolt of the left, socialist revolutionaries and its suppression. 5th Congress of Soviets and adoption of the Constitution of the RSFSR. Brief summary. Chapter 8. The Bolshevik Party in the period of foreign military intervention and civil war. 1918-1920. 1. Beginning of foreign military intervention. First period of the Civil War. 2. Defeat of Germany in the war. Revolution in Germany. Founding of the Third International, 8th Party Congress. 3. Extension of intervention. Blockade of the Soviet country. Kolchak's campaign and defeat. Denikin's campaign and defeat. A 3 months respite, 9th Party Congress. 4. Polish gentry attack Soviet Russia. General Wrangel's campaign. Failure of the Polish plan. Rout of Wrangel. End of the intervention. 5. How and why the Soviet Republic defeated the combined forces of British, French, Japanese, Polish intervention and of the bourgeois landlord White Guard counter-revolution in Russia. Brief summary. Chapter 9. The Bolshevik Party in the period of transition to the peaceful work of economic restoration. 1921-1925. 1. Soviet Republic after the defeat of the intervention and end of the Civil War. Difficulties of the restoration period. 2. Party discussion on the trade unions, 10th Party Congress. Defeat of the opposition. Adoption of the new economic policy, NEP. 3. First results of NEP. 11th Party Congress. Formation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Lenin's illness. Lenin's cooperative plan. 12th Party Congress. From Marx to Mao. Not 4. Commercial distribution. 4. Struggle against the difficulties of economic restoration. Trotskyites take advantage of Lenin's illness to increase their activity. New party discussion. Defeat of the Trotskyites. Death of Lenin. The Lenin enrollment, 13th Party Congress. 5. The Soviet Union towards the end of the Restoration period. The question of socialist construction and the victory of socialism in our country. Zinoviev Kamenev, new opposition. 14th Party Congress. Policy of socialist industrialization of the country. Brief summary. Chapter 10. The Bolshevik Party in the struggle for the socialist industrialization of the country. 1926-1929. 1. Difficulties in the period of socialist industrialization and the fight to overcome them. Formation of the anti-party bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites. Anti-Soviet actions of the bloc. Defeat of the bloc. 2. Progress of socialist industrialization. Agriculture lags. 15th Party Congress. Policy of collectivization in agriculture. Rout of the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites. Political duplicity. 3. Offensive against the kulaks. The Bukharin-Rykov anti-party group. Adoption of the first five-year plan, socialist. Emulation. Beginning of the mass collective farm movement. Brief summary. Chapter 11. The Bolshevik Party in the Struggle for the Collectivization of Agriculture, 1930-1934. 1. International situation in 1930-34. Economic crisis in the capitalist countries. Japanese annexation of Manchuria. Fascists' advent to power in Germany. 2 seats of war. 2. From the policy of restricting the kulak elements to the policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class. Struggle against distortions of the party policy in the collective farm movement. Offensive against the capitalist elements along the whole line. 16th Party Congress 3. Policy of reconstructing all branches of the national economy. Importance of technique. Further spread of the collective farm movement. Political departments of the machine and tractor stations. Results of the fulfillment of the 5-year plan in 4 years. Victory of socialism along the whole front. 17th Party Congress 4. Degeneration of the Bukharinites into political double dealers. Degeneration of the Trotskyite double dealers into a White Guard gang of assassins and spies. Foul murder of SM Kirov. Measures of the party to heighten Bolshevik vigilance. Brief summary. Chapter 12. The Bolshevik Party in the Struggle to Complete the Building of the Socialist Society. Introduction. Of the New Constitution, 1935-1937. 1. International situation in 1935-37. Temporary mitigation of the economic crisis. Beginning of a new economic crisis. Seizure of Ethiopia by Italy. German and Italian intervention in Spain. Japanese invasion of central China. Beginning of the Second Imperialist War. 2. Further progress of industry and agriculture in the USSR. Second 5-year plan fulfilled ahead of time. Reconstruction of agriculture and completion of collectivization. Importance of cadres. Stakhanov movement. Rising standard of welfare. Rising cultural standard. Strength of the Soviet Revolution. 3. 8th Congress of Soviets. Adoption of the new constitution of the USSR. 4. Liquidation of the remnants of the Bukharin-Trotsky gang of spies, wreckers and traitors to the country. Preparations for the election of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Broad inter-party democracy as the party's course. Election of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Conclusion. Glossary. History of the Communist Party. Of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks. INTRODUCTION. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, has traversed a long and glorious road, leading from the first tiny Marxist circles and groups that appeared in Russia in the 80s of the past century to the great party of the Bolsheviks, which now directs the first socialist state of workers and peasants in the world. The CPSU, grew up on the basis of the working class movement in pre-revolutionary Russia. It sprang from the Marxist circles and groups which had established connection with the working class movement and imparted to it a socialist consciousness. The CPSU, has always been guided by the revolutionary teachings of Marxism-Leninism. In the new conditions of the era of imperialism, imperialist wars and proletarian revolutions, its leaders further developed the teachings of Marx and Engels and raised them to a new level. The CPSU, grew and gained strength in a fight over fundamental principles waged against the petty bourgeois parties within the working class movement, the socialist revolutionaries, and earlier still, against their predecessors, the Narodniks, the Mensheviks, anarchists and bourgeois nationalists of all shades, and, within the party itself, against the Menshevik, opportunist trends, the Trotskyites, Bukharinites, nationalist deviators and other anti-Leninist groups. The CPSU, gained strength and became tempered in the revolutionary struggle against all enemies of the working class and of all working people, against landlords, capitalists, kulaks, wreckers, spies, against all the hirelings of the surrounding capitalist states. The history of the CPSU, is the history of 3 revolutions. The Bourgeois Democratic Revolution of 1905, the Bourgeois Democratic Revolution of February 1917, and the Socialist Revolution of October 1917. The history of the CPSU, is the history of the overthrow of TSRDM, of the overthrow of the power of the landlords and capitalists. It is the history of the rout of the armed foreign intervention during the Civil War. It is the history of the building of the Soviet state and of socialist society in our country. The study of the history of the CPSU, enriches us with the experience of the fight for socialism waged by the workers and peasants of our country. The study of the history of the CPSU, the history of the struggle of our party against all enemies of Marxism-Leninism, against all enemies of the working people, helps us to master Bolshevism and sharpens our political vigilance. The study of the heroic history of the Bolshevik Party arms us with a knowledge of the laws of social development and of the political struggle, with a knowledge of the motive forces of revolution. The study of the history of the CPSU, b. strengthens our certainty of the ultimate victory of the great cause of the party of Lenin-Stalin, the victory of communism throughout the world. This book sets forth briefly the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks. CHAPTERONE. The struggle for the creation of a social democratic labor party in Russia. 18831-901. 1. Abolition of serfdom and the development of industrial capitalism in Russia. Rise of the modern industrial proletariat. First steps of the working class movement. Tsarist Russia entered the path of capitalist development later than other countries. Prior to the 60s of the past century, there were very few mills and factories in Russia. Manorial estates based on serfdom constituted the prevailing form of economy. There could be no real development of industry under serfdom. The involuntary labor of the serfs in agriculture was of low productivity. The whole course of economic development made the abolition of serfdom imperative. In 1861, the Tsarist government, weakened by defeat in the Crimean War, and frightened by the peasant revolts against the landlords, was compelled to abolish serfdom. But even after serfdom had been abolished, the landlords continued to oppress the peasants. In the process of emancipation, they robbed the peasants by enclosing, cutting off, considerable portions of the land previously used by the peasants. These cut-off portions of land were called by the peasants otrezki, cuts. The peasants were compelled to pay about 2 billion rubles to the landlords as the redemption price for their emancipation. After serfdom had been abolished, the peasants were obliged to rent land from the landlords on most onerous terms. In addition to paying money rent, the peasants were often compelled by the landlord to cultivate without remuneration a definite portion of his land with their own implements and horses. This was called otrobotki or barshchina, labor rent, corvée. In most cases the peasants were obliged to pay the landlord's rent in kind in the amount of 1/2 of their harvests. This was known as ispolu, half and half system. Thus the situation remained almost the same as it had been under serfdom, the only difference being that the peasant was now personally free, could not be bought and sold like a chattel. The landlords bled the backward peasant farms white by various methods of extortion, rent, fines. Owing to the oppression of the landlords, the bulk of the peasantry were unable to improve their farms. Hence the extreme backwardness of agriculture in pre-revolutionary Russia, which led to frequent crop failures and famines. The survivals of serfdom, crushing taxation and the redemption payments to the landlords, which not infrequently exceeded the income of the peasant household, ruined the peasants, reduced them to pauperism and forced them to quit their villages in search of a livelihood. They went to work in the mills and factories. This was a source of cheap labor power for the manufacturers. Over the workers and peasants stood a veritable army of sheriffs, deputy sheriffs, gendarmes, constables, rural police, who protected the czar, the capitalists and the landlords from the toiling and exploited people. Corporal punishment existed right up to 1903. Although serfdom had been abolished, the peasants were flogged for the slightest offense and for the non-payment of taxes. Workers were manhandled by the police and the Cossacks, especially during strikes, when the workers downed tools because their lives had been made intolerable by the manufacturers. Under the czars, the workers and peasants had no political rights whatever. The Tsarist autocracy was the worst enemy of the people. Tsarist Russia was a prison of nations. The numerous non-Russian nationalities were entirely devoid of rights and were subjected to constant insult and humiliation of every kind. The Tsarist government taught the Russian population to look down upon the native peoples of the national regions as an inferior race, officially referred to them as inorotsi, aliens, and fostered contempt and hatred of them. The Tsarist government deliberately fanned national discord, instigated one nation against another, engineered Jewish pogroms and, in Transcaucasia, incited Tatars and Armenians to massacre each other. Nearly all, if not all, government posts in the national regions were held by Russian officials. All business in government institutions and in the courts was conducted in the Russian language. It was forbidden to publish newspapers and books in the languages of the non-Russian nationalities or to teach in the schools in the native tongue. The Tsarist government strove to extinguish every spark of national culture and pursued a policy of forcible Russification. Tsardom was a hangman and torturer of the non-Russian peoples. Italism in Russia proceeded at a fairly rapid pace in spite of the fact that it was still hampered by survivals of serfdom. During the 25 years, 1865 to 90, the number of workers employed in large mills and factories and on the railways increased from 706,000 to 1,433,000, or more than doubled. Large-scale capitalist industry in Russia began to develop even more rapidly in the 90s. By the end of that decade, the number of workers employed in the large mills and factories, in the mining industry and on the railways amounted in the 50 European provinces of Russia alone to 2,207,000, and in the whole of Russia to 2,792,000 persons. This was a modern industrial proletariat, radically different from the workers employed in the factories of the period of serfdom and from the workers in small, handicraft and other kinds of industry, both because of the spirit of solidarity prevailing among the workers in big capitalist enterprises and because of their militant revolutionary qualities. The industrial boom of the 90s was chiefly due to intensive railroad construction. During the course of the decade, 1890 to 1900, over 21,000 versts of new railway line were laid. The railways created a big demand for metal, for rails, locomotives and cars, and also for increasing quantities of fuel, coal and oil. This led to the development of the metal and fuel industries. In pre-revolutionary Russia, as in all capitalist countries, periods of industrial boom alternated with industrial crises, stagnation, which severely affected the working class and condemned hundreds of thousands of workers to unemployment and poverty. Although the development of capitalism in Russia proceeded fairly rapidly after the abolition of serfdom, nevertheless, in economic development Russia lagged considerably behind other capitalist countries. The vast majority of the population was still engaged in agriculture. In his celebrated work, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, Lenin cited significant figures from the general census of the population of 1897 which showed that about 5/6 of the total population were engaged in agriculture, and only 1/6 in large and small industry, trade, on the railways and waterways, in building work, lumbering, and so on. This shows that although capitalism was developing in Russia, she was still an agrarian, economically backward country, a petty bourgeois country, that is, a country in which low productive individual peasant farming based on small ownership still predominated. Capitalism was developing not only in the towns but also in the countryside. The peasantry, the most numerous class in pre-revolutionary Russia, was undergoing a process of disintegration, of cleavage. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution. From among the more well-to-do peasants there was emerging an upper layer of kulaks, the rural bourgeoisie, while on the other hand many peasants were being ruined, and the number of poor peasants, rural proletarians and semi-proletarians, was on the increase. As to the middle peasants, their number decreased from year to year. In 1903 there were about 10 million peasant households in Russia. In his pamphlet entitled To the Village Poor, Lenin calculated that of this total not less than 3.5 million households consisted of peasants possessing no horses. These were the poorest peasants who usually sowed only a small part of their land, leased the rest to the kulaks, and themselves left to seek other sources of livelihood. The position of these peasants came nearest to that of the proletariat. Lenin called them rural proletarians or semi-proletarians. On the other hand, 1.5 million rich, kulak households, out of a total of 10 million peasant households, concentrated in their hands half the total sown area of the peasants. This peasant bourgeoisie was growing rich by grinding down the poor and middle peasantry and profiting from the toil of agricultural laborers, and was developing into rural capitalists. The working class of Russia began to awaken already in the 70s, and especially in the 80s, and started a struggle against the capitalists. Exceedingly hard was the lot of the workers in Tsarist Russia. In the 80s the working day in the mills and factories was not less than 2 hours, and in the textile industry reached 4 to 5 hours. The exploitation of female and child labor was widely resorted to. Children worked the same hours as adults, but, like the women, received a much smaller wage. Wages were inordinately low. The majority of the workers were paid 7 or 8 rubles per month. The most highly paid workers in the metalworks and foundries received no more than 35 rubles per month. There were no regulations for the protection of labor, with the result that workers were maimed and killed in large numbers. Workers were not insured, and all medical services had to be paid for. Housing conditions were appalling. In the factory-owned barracks, workers were crowded as many as I0 or I2 to a small cell. In paying wages, the manufacturers often cheated the workers, compelled them to make their purchases in the factory-owned shops at exorbitant prices, and mulcted them by means of fines. The workers began to take a common stand and present joint demands to the factory workers for the improvement of their intolerable conditions. They would down tools and go on strike. The earlier strikes in the 70s and 80s were usually provoked by excessive fines, cheating and swindling of the workers over wages, and reductions in the rates of pay. In the earlier strikes, the workers, driven to despair, would sometimes smash machinery, break factory windows and wreck factory-owned shops and factory offices. The more advanced workers began to realize that if they were to be successful in their struggle against the capitalists, they needed organization. Workers' unions began to arise. In 1875 the South Russian Workers' Union was formed in Odessa. This first workers' organization lasted 8 or 9 months and was then smashed by the Tsarist government. In 1878 the Northern Union of Russian Workers was formed in St. Petersburg, headed by Kalterin, a carpenter, and Obnorsky, a fitter. The program of the union stated that its aims and objects were similar to those of the social democratic labor parties of the West. The ultimate aim of the union was to bring about a socialist revolution, the overthrow of the existing political and economic system, as an extremely unjust system. Obnorsky, one of the founders of the Union, had lived abroad for some time and had there acquainted himself with the activities of the Marxist Social Democratic parties and of the First International, which was directed by Marx. This circumstance left its impress on the program of the Northern Union of Russian Workers. The immediate aim of the Union was to win political liberty and political rights for the people, freedom of speech, press, assembly, etc. The immediate demands also included a reduction of the working day. The membership of the Union reached 200, and it had about as many sympathizers. It began to take part in workers' strikes, to lead them. The Tsarist government smashed this workers' union too. But the working class movement continued to grow, spreading from district to district. The 80s were marked by a large number of strikes. In the space of 5 years, 1881 to 86, there were as many as 48 strikes involving 80,000 workers. An exceptional part in the history of the revolutionary movement was played by the big strike that broke out at the Morozov mill in Orahovo-Zuyevo in 1885. About 8,000 workers were employed at this mill. Working conditions grew worse from day to day. There were 5 wage cuts between 1882 and 1884, and in the latter year rates were reduced by 25% at one blow. In addition, Morozov, the manufacturer, tormented the workers with fines. It was revealed at the trial which followed the strike that of every ruble earned by the workers, from 30 to 50 kopecks, went into the pocket of the manufacturer in the form of fines. The workers could not stand this robbery any longer and in January 1885 went out on strike. The strike had been organized beforehand. It was led by a politically advanced worker, Pyotr Moiseyenko, who had been a member of the Northern Union of Russian Workers and already had some revolutionary experience. On the eve of the strike, Moiseyenko and others of the more class-conscious weavers drew up a number of demands for presentation to the mill owners. They were endorsed at a secret meeting of the workers. The chief demand was the abolition of the rapacious fines. This strike was suppressed by armed force. Over 600 workers were arrested and scores of them committed for trial. Similar strikes broke out in the mills of Ivanovo-Voznesensk in 1885. In the following year, the Tsarist government was compelled by its fear of the growth of the working class movement to promulgate a law on fines which provided that the proceeds from fines were not to go into the pockets of the manufacturers but were to be used for the needs of the workers themselves. The Morozov and other strikes taught the workers that a great deal could be gained by organized struggle. The working class movement began to produce capable leaders and organizers who staunchly championed the interests of the working class. At the same time, on the basis of the growth of the working class movement and under the influence of the working class movement of Western Europe, the first Marxist organizations began to arise in Russia. 2. Narodism, Populism, and Marxism in Russia, Plekhanov. And his Emancipation of Labor group, Plekhanov's Fight Against Narodism, Spread of Marxism in Russia. Prior to the appearance of the Marxist group's revolutionary work in Russia was carried on by the Narodniks, populists, who were opponents of Marxism. The first Russian Marxist group arose in 1883. This was the Emancipation of Labor group formed by G.V. Plekhanov abroad, in Geneva, where he had been obliged to take refuge from the persecution of the Tsarist government for his revolutionary activities. Previously, Plekhanov had himself been a Narodnik. But having studied Marxism while abroad, he broke with Narodism and became an outstanding propagandist of Marxism. The Emancipation of Labor group did a great deal to disseminate Marxism in Russia. They translated works of Marx and Engels into Russian, the Communist Manifesto, Wage Labor and Capital, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, etc., had them printed abroad and circulated them secretly in Russia. Plekhanov, Zasulik, Axelrod and other members of this group also wrote a number of works explaining the teachings of Marx and Engels, the ideas of scientific socialism. Marx and Engels, the great teachers of the proletariat, were the first to explain that, contrary to the opinion of the utopian socialists, socialism was not the invention of dreamers, utopians, but the inevitable outcome of the development of modern capitalist society. They showed that the capitalist system would fall, just as serfdom had fallen, and that capitalism was creating its own gravediggers in the person of the proletariat. They showed that only the class struggle of the proletariat, only the victory of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie, would rid humanity of capitalism and exploitation. Marx and Engels taught the proletariat to be conscious of its own strength, to be conscious of its class interests and to unite for a determined struggle against the bourgeoisie. Marx and Engels discovered the laws of development of capitalist society and proved scientifically that the development of capitalist society, and the class struggle going on within it, must inevitably lead to the fall of capitalism, to the victory of the proletariat, to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx and Engels taught that it was impossible to get rid of the power of capital and to convert capitalist property into public property by peaceful means, and that the working class could achieve this only by revolutionary violence against the bourgeoisie, by a proletarian revolution, by establishing its own political rule, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which must crush the resistance of the exploiters and create a new, classless, communist society. Marx and Engels taught that the industrial proletariat is the most revolutionary and therefore the most advanced class in capitalist society, and that only a class like the proletariat could rally around itself all the forces discontented with capitalism and lead them in the storming of capitalism. But in order to vanquish the old world and create a new, classless society, the proletariat must have its own working class party, which Marx and Engels called the Communist Party. It was to the dissemination of the views of Marx and Engels that the first Russian Marxist group, Plekhanov's Emancipation of Labor group, devoted itself. Ism in the Russian press abroad at a time when no social democratic movement in Russia yet existed. It was first necessary to prepare the theoretical, ideological ground for such a movement. The chief ideological obstacle to the spread of Marxism and of the social democratic movement was the Narodnik views which at that time prevailed among the advanced workers and the revolutionary-minded intelligentsia. As capitalism developed in Russia, the working class became a powerful and advanced force that was capable of waging an organized revolutionary struggle. But the leading role of the working class was not understood by the Narodniks. The Russian Narodniks erroneously held that the principal revolutionary force was not the working class, but the peasantry, and that the rule of the Tsar and the landlords could be overthrown by means of peasant revolts alone. The Narodniks did not know the working class and did not realize that the peasants alone were incapable of vanquishing TSRDM and the landlords without an alliance with the working class and without its guidance. The Narodniks did not understand that the working class was the most revolutionary and the most advanced class of society. The Narodniks first endeavored to rouse the peasants for a struggle against the Tsarist government. With this purpose in view, young revolutionary intellectuals donned peasant garb and flocked to the countryside, to the people, as it used to be called. Hence the term, Narodnik, from the word narod, the people. But they found no backing among the peasantry, for they did not have a proper knowledge or understanding of the peasants either. The majority of them were arrested by the police. Thereupon the Narodniks decided to continue the struggle against the Tsarist autocracy single-handed, without the people, and this led to even more serious mistakes. A secret Narodnik society known as Narodnaya Volia, People's Will, began to plot the assassination of the Tsar. On March 1, 1881, members of the Narodnaya Volia succeeded in killing Tsar Alexander II with a bomb. But the people did not benefit from this in any way. The assassination of individuals could not bring about the overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy or the abolition of the landlord class. The assassinated Tsar was replaced by another, Alexander III, under whom the conditions of the workers and peasants became still worse. The method of combating TSRDM chosen by the Narodniks, namely, by the assassination of individuals, by individual terrorism, was wrong and detrimental to the revolution. The policy of individual terrorism was based on the erroneous Narodnik theory of active heroes and a passive mob, which awaited exploits from the heroes. This false theory maintained that it is only outstanding individuals who make history, while the masses, the people, the class, the mob, as the Narodnik writers contemptuously called them, are incapable of conscious, organized activity and can only blindly follow the heroes. For this reason the Narodniks abandoned mass revolutionary work among the peasantry and the working class and changed to individual terrorism. They induced one of the most prominent revolutionaries of the time, Stepan Kalterin, to give up his work of organizing a revolutionary workers' union and to devote himself entirely to terrorism. By these assassinations of individual representatives of the class of exploiters, assassinations that were of no benefit to the revolution, the Narodniks diverted the attention of the working people from the struggle against that class as a whole. They hampered the development of the revolutionary initiative and activity of the working class and the peasantry. The Narodniks prevented the working class from understanding its leading role in the revolution and retarded the creation of an independent party of the working class. Although the Narodnik secret organization had been smashed by the Tsarist government, Narodnik views continued to persist for a long time among the revolutionary-minded intelligentsia. The surviving Narodniks stubbornly resisted the spread of Marxism in Russia and hampered the organization of the working class. Marxism in Russia could therefore grow and gain strength only by combating Narodism. The Emancipation of Labor group launched a fight against the erroneous views of the Narodniks and showed how greatly their views and methods of struggle were prejudicing the working class movement. In his writings directed against the Narodniks, Plekhanov showed that their views had nothing in common with scientific socialism, even though they called themselves socialists. Plekhanov was the first to give a Marxist criticism of the erroneous views of the Narodniks. Delivering well-aimed blows at the Narodnik views, Plekhanov at the same time developed a brilliant defense of the Marxist views. What were the major errors of the Narodniks which Plekhanov hammered at with such destructive effect? First, the Narodniks asserted that capitalism was something accidental, in Russia, that it would not develop, and that therefore the proletariat would not grow and develop either. Secondly, the Narodniks did not regard the working class as the foremost class in the revolution. They dreamed of attaining socialism without the proletariat. They considered that the principal revolutionary force was the peasantry, led by the intelligentsia, and the peasant commune, which they regarded as the embryo and foundation of socialism. Thirdly, the Narodniks' view of the whole course of human history was erroneous and harmful. They neither knew nor understood the laws of the economic and political development of society. In this respect they were quite backward. According to them, history was made not by classes, and not by the struggle of classes, but by outstanding individuals, heroes, who were blindly followed by the masses, the mob, the people, the classes. In combating and exposing the Narodniks, Plekhanov wrote a number of Marxist works which were instrumental in rearing and educating the Marxists in Russia. Such works of his as Socialism and the Political Struggle, Our Differences, on the development of the monistic view of history cleared the way for the victory of Marxism in Russia. In his works, Plekhanov expounded the basic principles of Marxism. Of particular importance was his On the Development of the Monistic View of History, published in 1895. Lenin said that this book served to rear a whole generation of Russian Marxists. Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. ed. Volume 14, page 347. In his writings aimed against the Narodniks, Plekhanov showed that it was absurd to put the question the way the Narodniks did. Should capitalism develop in Russia or not? As a matter of fact, Russia had already entered the path of capitalist development, Plekhanov said, producing facts to prove it, and there was no force that could divert her from this path. The task of the revolutionaries was not to arrest the development of capitalism in Russia, that they could not do anyhow. Their task was to secure the support of the powerful revolutionary force brought into being by the development of capitalism, namely, the working class, to develop its class consciousness, to organize it, and to help it to create its own working class party. Plekhanov also shattered the second major error of the Narodniks, namely, their denial of the role of the proletariat as the vanguard in the revolutionary struggle. The Narodniks looked upon the rise of the proletariat in Russia as something in the nature of a historical misfortune, and spoke of the ulcer of proletarianism. Plekhanov, championing the teachings of Marxism, showed that they were fully applicable to Russia, and that in spite of the numerical preponderance of the peasantry and the relative numerical weakness of the proletariat, it was on the proletariat and on its growth that the revolutionaries should base their chief hopes. Why on the proletariat? Because the proletariat, although it was still numerically small, was a laboring class which was connected with the most advanced form of economy, large-scale production, and which for this reason had a great future before it. Because the proletariat, as a class, was growing from year to year, was developing politically, easily lent itself to organization owing to the conditions of labor prevailing in large-scale production, and was the most revolutionary class owing to its proletarian status, for it had nothing to lose in the revolution but its chains. The case was different with the peasantry. The peasantry, meaning here the individual peasants, each of whom worked for himself, despite its numerical strength, was a laboring class that was connected with the most backward form of economy, small-scale production, owing to which it had not and could not have any great future before it. Far from growing as a class, the peasantry was splitting up more and more into bourgeois, kulaks, and poor peasants, proletarians and semi-proletarians. Moreover, being scattered, it lent itself less easily than the proletariat to organization, and, consisting of small owners, it joined the revolutionary movement less readily than the proletariat. The Narodniks maintained that socialism in Russia would come not through the dictatorship of the proletariat, but through the peasant commune, which they regarded as the embryo and basis of socialism. But the commune was neither the basis nor the embryo of socialism, nor could it be, because the commune was dominated by the kulaks, the bloodsuckers who exploited the poor peasants, the agricultural laborers and the economically weaker middle peasants. The formal existence of communal land ownership and the periodical redivision of the land according to the number of mouths in each peasant household did not alter the situation in any way. Those members of the commune used the land who owned draft cattle, implements and seed, that is, the well-to-do middle peasants and kulaks. The peasants who possessed no horses, the poor peasants, the small peasants generally, had to surrender their land to the kulaks and to hire themselves out as agricultural laborers. As a matter of fact, the peasant commune was a convenient means of masking the dominance of the kulaks and an inexpensive instrument in the hands of the Tsarist government for the collection of taxes from the peasants on the basis of collective responsibility. That was why T.S. Artem left the peasant commune intact. It was absurd to regard a commune of this character as the embryo or basis of socialism. Plekhanov shattered the third major error of the Narodniks as well, namely, that heroes, outstanding individuals, and their ideas played a prime role in social development, and that the role of the masses, the mob, the people, classes, was insignificant. Plekhanov accused the Narodniks of idealism, and showed that the truth lay not with idealism, but with the materialism of Marx and Engels. Plekhanov expounded and substantiated the view of Marxist materialism. In conformity with Marxist materialism, he showed that in the long run the development of society is determined not by the wishes and ideas of outstanding individuals, but by the development of the material conditions of existence of society, by the changes in the mode of production of the material wealth required for the existence of society, by the changes in the mutual relations of classes in the production of material wealth, by the struggle of classes for place and position in the production and distribution of material wealth. It was not ideas that determined the social and economic status of men, but the social and economic status of men that determined their ideas. Outstanding individuals may become nonentities if their ideas and wishes run counter to the economic development of society, to the needs of the foremost class, and vice versa. Outstanding people may really become outstanding individuals if their ideas and wishes correctly express the needs of the economic development of society, the needs of the foremost class. In answer to the Narodnik's assertion that the masses are nothing but a mob, and that it is heroes who make history and convert the mob into a people, the Marxists affirmed that it is not heroes that make history, but history that makes heroes, and that, consequently, it is not heroes who create a people, but the people who create heroes and move history onward. Heroes, outstanding individuals, may play an important part in the life of society only insofar as they are capable of correctly understanding the conditions of development of society and the ways of changing them for the better. Heroes, outstanding individuals, may become ridiculous and useless failures if they do not correctly understand the conditions of development of society and go counter to the historical needs of society in the conceited belief that they are makers of history. To this category of ill-starred heroes belonged the Narodniks. Gentsia. But the ideological destruction of Narodism was still far from complete. It was left to Lenin to deal the final blow to Narodism as an enemy of Marxism. Soon after the suppression of the Narodnaya Volia party, the majority of the Narodniks renounced the revolutionary struggle against the Tsarist government and began to preach a policy of reconciliation and agreement with it. In the 80s and 90s, the Narodniks began to voice the interests of the kulaks. The Emancipation of Labor group prepared two drafts of a program for a Russian Social Democratic Party, the first in 1884 and the second in 1887. This was a very important preparatory step in the formation of a Marxist Social Democratic Party in Russia. But at the same time, the Emancipation of Labor group was guilty of some very serious mistakes. Its first draft program still contained vestiges of the Narodnik views. It countenanced the tactics of individual terrorism. Furthermore, Plekhanov failed to take into account that in the course of the revolution the proletariat could and should lead the peasantry, and that only in an alliance with the peasantry could the proletariat gain the victory over TSRDM. Plekhanov further considered that the liberal bourgeoisie was a force that could give support, albeit unstable support, to the revolution. But as to the peasantry, in some of his writings he discounted it entirely, declaring, for instance, that apart from the bourgeoisie and the proletariat we perceive no social forces in our country in which oppositional or revolutionary combinations might find support. Plekhanov, Works, Russ, ed. Volume 3, page 119. These erroneous views were the germ of Plekhanov's future Menshevik views. Neither the Emancipation of Labor group nor the Marxist circles of that period had yet any practical connections with the working class movement. It was a period in which the theory of Marxism, the ideas of Marxism, and the principles of the social democratic program were just appearing and gaining a foothold in Russia. In the decade of 1884 to 94, the social democratic movement still existed in the form of small separate groups and circles which had no connections, or very scant connections, with the mass working class movement. Like an infant still unborn but already developing in its mother's womb, the social democratic movement, as Lenin wrote, was in the process of fetal development. The Emancipation of Labor group, Lenin said, only laid the theoretical foundations for the social democratic movement and made the first step towards the working class movement. The task of uniting Marxism and the working class movement in Russia, and of correcting the mistakes of the Emancipation of Labor group, fell to Lenin. 3. Beginning of Lenin's revolutionary activities. St. Petersburg League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, the founder of Bolshevism, was born in the city of Simbirsk, now Ulanovska, in 1870. In 1887 Lenin entered the Kazan University, but was soon arrested and expelled from the university for taking part in the revolutionary student movement. In Kazan, Lenin joined a Marxist circle formed by one Fedoseev. Lenin later removed to Samara, and soon afterwards the first Marxist circle in that city was formed with Lenin as the central figure. Already in those days Lenin amazed everyone by his thorough knowledge of Marxism. At the end of 1893 Lenin removed to St. Petersburg. His very first utterances in the Marxist circles of that city made a deep impression on their members. His extraordinarily profound knowledge of Marx, his ability to apply Marxism to the economic and political situation of Russia at that time, his ardent and unshakable belief in the victory of the workers' cause, and his outstanding talent as an organizer made Lenin the acknowledged leader of the St. Petersburg Marxists. Lenin enjoyed the warm affection of the politically advanced workers whom he taught in the circles. Our lectures, says the worker Babushkin recalling Lenin's teaching activities in the workers' circles, were of a very lively and interesting character. We were all very pleased with these lectures and constantly admired the wisdom of our lecturer. In 1895 Lenin united all the Marxist workers' circles in St. Petersburg, there were already about 20 of them, into a single league of struggle for the emancipation of the working class. He thus prepared the way for the founding of a revolutionary Marxist Workers' Party. Lenin put before the League of Struggle the task of forming closer connections with the mass working class movement and of giving it political leadership. Lenin proposed to pass from the propaganda of Marxism among the few politically advanced workers who gathered in the propaganda circles to political agitation among the broad masses of the working class on issues of the day. This turn towards mass agitation was of profound importance for the subsequent development of the working class movement in Russia. The 90s were a period of industrial boom. The number of workers was increasing. The working class movement was gaining strength. In the period of 1895 to 99, according to incomplete data, not less than 221,000 workers took part in strikes. The working class movement was becoming an important force in the political life of the country. The course of events was corroborating the view which the Marxists had championed against the Narodniks, namely, that the working class was to play the leading role in the revolutionary movement. Under Lenin's guidance, the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class linked up the struggle of the workers for economic demands, improvement of working conditions, shorter hours and higher wages, with the political struggle against TSRDM. The League of Struggle educated the workers politically. Under Lenin's guidance, the St. Petersburg League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class was the first body in Russia that began to unite socialism with the working class movement. When a strike broke out in some factory, the League of Struggle, which through the members of its circles was kept well posted on the state of affairs in the factories, immediately responded by issuing leaflets in socialist proclamations. These leaflets exposed the oppression of the workers by the manufacturers, explained how the workers should fight for their interests, and set forth the workers' demands. The leaflets told the plain truth about the ulcers of capitalism, the poverty of the workers, their intolerably hard working day of 12 to 14 hours, and their utter lack of rights. They also put forward appropriate political demands. With the collaboration of the worker Babushkin, Lenin at the end of 1894 wrote the first agitational leaflet of this kind and an appeal to the workers of the Semyonikov works in St. Petersburg who were on strike. In the autumn of 1895 Lenin wrote a leaflet for the men and women strikers of the Thornton mills. These mills belonged to English owners who were making millions in profits out of them. The working day in these mills exceeded 14 hours, while the wages of a weaver were about 7 rubles per month. The workers won the strike. In a short space of time the League of Struggle printed dozens of such leaflets and appeals to the workers of various factories. Every leaflet greatly helped to stiffen the spirit of the workers. They saw that the socialists were helping and defending them. In the summer of 1896 a strike of 30,000 textile workers, led by the League of Struggle, took place in St. Petersburg. The chief demand was for shorter hours. This strike forced the Tsarist government to pass, on June 2, 1897, a law limiting the working day to 11 hours. Prior to this the working day was not limited in any way. In December 1895 Lenin was arrested by the Tsarist government. But even in prison he did not discontinue his revolutionary work. He assisted the League of Struggle with advice and direction and wrote pamphlets and leaflets for it. There he wrote a pamphlet entitled On Strikes and a leaflet entitled To the Tsarist Government, exposing its savage despotism. There too Lenin drafted a program for the party. He used milk as an invisible ink and wrote between the lines of a book on medicine. The St. Petersburg League of Struggle gave a powerful impetus to the amalgamation of the workers' circles in other cities and regions of Russia into similar leagues. In the middle of the 90s Marxist organizations arose in Transcaucasia. In 1894 a workers' union was formed in Moscow. Towards the end of the 90s a social democratic union was formed in Siberia. In the 90s Marxist groups arose in Ivanovo-Voznesensk, Yaroslavl and Kostroma and subsequently merged to form the Northern Union of the Social Democratic Party. In the second half of the 90s social democratic groups and unions were formed in Rostov-on-Don, Ekaterinoslav, Kiev, Nikolaev, Tula, Samara, Kazan, Orahovo-Zuyevo and other cities. The importance of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle for the emancipation of the working class consisted in the fact that, as Lenin said, it was the first real rudiment of a revolutionary party which was backed by the working class movement. Lenin drew on the revolutionary experience of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle in his subsequent work of creating a Marxist Social Democratic Party in Russia. After the arrest of Lenin and his close associates, the leadership of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle changed considerably. New people appeared who called themselves the young, and Lenin and his associates the old fellows. These people pursued an erroneous political line. They declared that the workers should be called upon to wage only an economic struggle against their employers. As for the political struggle, that was the affair of the liberal bourgeoisie, to whom the leadership of the political struggle should be left. These people came to be called economists. They were the first group of compromisers and opportunists within the ranks of the Marxist organizations in Russia. 4. Lenin's struggle against narodism and legal Marxism. Lenin's idea of an alliance of the working class and the peasantry. First Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Although Plekhanov had already in the 80s dealt the chief blow to the Narodnik system of views, at the beginning of the 90s Narodnik views still found sympathy among certain sections of the revolutionary youth. Some of them continued to hold that Russia could avoid the capitalist path of development and that the principal role in the revolution would be played by the peasantry, and not by the working class. The Narodniks that still remained did their utmost to prevent the spread of Marxism in Russia, fought the Marxists and endeavored to discredit them in every way. Narodism had to be completely smashed ideologically if the further spread of Marxism and the creation of a social democratic party were to be assured. This task was performed by Lenin. In his book, What the Friends of the People Are and How They Fight Against the Social Democrats, 1894, Lenin thoroughly exposed the true character of the Narodniks, showing that they were false friends of the people, actually working against the people. Essentially, the Narodniks of the 90s had long ago renounced all revolutionary struggle against the Tsarist government. The liberal Narodniks preached reconciliation with the Tsarist government. They think, Lenin wrote in reference to the Narodniks of that period, that if they simply plead with this government nicely enough and humbly enough, it will put everything right. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume I, page 413. The Narodniks of the 90s shut their eyes to the condition of the poor peasants, to the class struggle in the countryside, and to the exploitation of the poor peasants by the kulaks, and sang praises to the development of kulak farming. As a matter of fact, they voiced the interests of the kulaks. Asterisk quotations from English translations of Lenin and Stalin have been checked with the original and the translations in some cases revised. Tr. At the same time, the Narodniks in their periodicals baited the Marxists. They deliberately distorted and falsified the views of the Russian Marxists and claimed that the latter desired the ruin of the countryside and wanted every muzhik to be stewed in the factory kettle. Lenin exposed the falsity of the Narodnik criticism and pointed out that it was not a matter of the wishes of the Marxists, but of the fact that capitalism was actually developing in Russia and that this development was inevitably accompanied by a growth of the proletariat. And the proletariat would be the gravedigger of the capitalist system. Lenin showed that it was the Marxists and not the Narodniks who were the real friends of the people, that it was the Marxists who wanted to throw off the capitalist and landlord yoke, to destroy TSRdom. In his book, What the Friends of the People Are, Lenin for the first time advanced the idea of a revolutionary alliance of the workers and peasants as the principal means of overthrowing TSRdom, the landlords and the bourgeoisie. In a number of his writings during this period, Lenin criticized the methods of political struggle employed by the principal Narodnik group, the Narodnaya Volia, and later by the successors of the Narodniks, the socialist revolutionaries, especially the tactics of individual terrorism. Lenin considered these tactics harmful to the revolutionary movement, for they substituted the struggle of individual heroes for the struggle of the masses. They signified a lack of confidence in the revolutionary movement of the people. In the book, What the Friends of the People Are, Lenin outlined the main tasks of the Russian Marxists. In his opinion, the first duty of the Russian Marxists was to weld the disunited Marxist circles into a united socialist workers' party. He further pointed out that it would be the working class of Russia, in alliance with the peasantry, that would overthrow the Tsarist autocracy, after which the Russian proletariat, in alliance with the laboring and exploited masses, would, along with the proletariat of other countries, take the straight road of open political struggle to the victorious communist revolution. Thus, over 40 years ago, Lenin correctly pointed out to the working class its path of struggle, defined its role as the foremost revolutionary force in society, and that of the peasantry as the ally of the working class. The struggle waged by Lenin and his followers against Narodism led to the latter's complete ideological defeat already in the 90s. Of immense significance, too, was Lenin's struggle against legal Marxism. It usually happens with big social movements in history that, from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution transient, fellow travelers fasten on them. The legal Marxists, as they were called, were such fellow travelers. Marxism began to spread widely throughout Russia, and so we found bourgeois intellectuals decking themselves out in a Marxist garb. They published their articles in newspapers and periodicals that were legal, that is, allowed by the Tsarist government. That is why they came to be called legal Marxists. After their own fashion, they too fought Narodism. But they tried to make use of this fight and of the banner of Marxism in order to subordinate and adapt the working class movement to the interests of bourgeois society, to the interests of the bourgeoisie. They cut out the very core of Marxism, namely, the doctrine of the proletarian revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. One prominent legal Marxist, Peter Struve, extolled the bourgeoisie, and instead of calling for a revolutionary struggle against capitalism, urged that we acknowledge our lack of culture and go to capitalism for schooling. In the fight against the Narodniks, Lenin considered it permissible to come to a temporary agreement with the legal Marxists in order to use them against the Narodniks, as, for example, for the joint publication of a collection of articles directed against the Narodniks. At the same time, however, Lenin was unsparing in his criticism of the legal Marxists and exposed their liberal bourgeois nature. Many of these fellow travelers later became constitutional Democrats, the principal party of the Russian bourgeoisie, and during the Civil War out-and-out White Guards. Along with the leagues of struggle in St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev and other places, social democratic organizations arose also in the western national border regions of Russia. In the 90s, the Marxist elements in the Polish Nationalist Party broke away to form the Social Democratic Party of Poland and Lithuania. At the end of the 90s, Latvian social democratic organizations were formed, and in October 1897 the Jewish General Social Democratic Union, known as the Bund, was founded in the western provinces of Russia. In 1898 several of the leagues of struggle, those of St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev and Ekaterinoslav, together with the Bund made the first attempt to unite and form a social democratic party. For this purpose they summoned the first Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, which was held in Minsk in March 1898. The first Congress of the RSDLP was attended by only 9 persons. Lenin was not present because at that time he was living in exile in Siberia. The Central Committee of the party elected at the Congress was very soon arrested. The manifesto published in the name of the Congress was in many respects unsatisfactory. It evaded the question of the conquest of political power by the proletariat, it made no mention of the hegemony of the proletariat, and said nothing about the allies of the proletariat in its struggle against TSRDM and the bourgeoisie. In its decisions and in its manifesto, the Congress announced the formation of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. It is this formal act, which played a great revolutionary propagandist role, that constituted the significance of the first Congress of the RSDLP. But although the first Congress had been held, in reality no Marxist Social Democratic Party was as yet formed in Russia. The Congress did not succeed in uniting the separate Marxist circles and organizations and welding them together organizationally. There was still no common line of action in the work of the local organizations, nor was there a party program, party rules or a single leading center. For this and for a number of other reasons, the ideological confusion in the local organizations began to increase, and this created favorable ground for the growth within the working class movement of the opportunist trend known as economism. It required several years of intense effort on the part of Lenin and of Iskra, Spark, the newspaper he founded, before this confusion could be overcome, the opportunist vacillations put an end to, and the way prepared for the formation of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. 5. Lenin's fight against economism. Appearance of Lenin's newspaper, Iskra. Lenin was not present at the first Congress of the RSDLP. He was at that time in exile in Siberia, in the village of Shushenskoye, where he had been banished by the Tsarist government after a long period of imprisonment in St. Petersburg in connection with the prosecution of the League of Struggle. But Lenin continued his revolutionary activities even while in exile. There he finished a highly important scientific work, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, which completed the ideological destruction of Narodism. There, too, he wrote his well-known pamphlet, The Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats. Although Lenin was cut off from direct, practical revolutionary work, he nevertheless managed to maintain some connections with those engaged in this work. He carried on a correspondence with them from exile, obtained information from them and gave them advice. At this time Lenin was very much preoccupied with the economists. He realized better than anybody else that economism was the main nucleus of compromise and opportunism, and that if economism were to gain the upper hand in the working class movement, it would undermine the revolutionary movement of the proletariat and lead to the defeat of Marxism. Lenin therefore started a vigorous attack on the economists as soon as they appeared on the scene. The economists maintained that the workers should engage only in the economic struggle. As to the political struggle, that should be left to the liberal bourgeoisie, whom the workers should support. In Lenin's eyes this tenet was a desertion of Marxism, a denial of the necessity for an independent political party of the working class, an attempt to convert the working class into a political appendage of the bourgeoisie. In 1899 a group of economists, Prokopovich, Kuskova and others, who later became constitutional Democrats, issued a manifesto in which they opposed revolutionary Marxism, and insisted that the idea of an independent political party of the proletariat and of independent political demands by the working class be renounced. The economists held that the political struggle was a matter for the liberal bourgeoisie, and that as far as the workers were concerned, the economic struggle against the employers was enough for them. When Lenin acquainted himself with this opportunist document, he called a conference of Marxist political exiles living in the vicinity. 17 of them met and, headed by Lenin, issued a trenchant protest denouncing the views of the economists. This protest, which was written by Lenin, was circulated among the Marxist organizations all over the country and played an outstanding part in the development of Marxist ideas and of the Marxist Party in Russia. The Russian economists advocated the same views as the opponents of Marxism in the social democratic parties abroad, who were known as the Bernsteinites, that is, followers of the opportunist Bernstein. Lenin's struggle against the economists was therefore at the same time a struggle against opportunism on an international scale. The fight against economism, the fight for the creation of an independent political party of the proletariat, was chiefly waged by Iskra, the illegal newspaper founded by Lenin. At the beginning of 1900, Lenin and other members of the League of Struggle returned from their Siberian exile to Russia. Lenin conceived the idea of founding a big illegal Marxist newspaper on an all-Russian scale. The numerous small Marxist circles and organizations which already existed in Russia were not yet linked up. At a moment when, in the words of Comrade Stalin, amateurishness and the parochial outlook of the circles were corroding the party from top to bottom, when ideological confusion was the characteristic feature of the internal life of the party, the creation of an illegal newspaper on an all-Russian scale was the chief task of the Russian revolutionary Marxists. Only such a newspaper could link up the disunited Marxist organizations and prepare the way for the creation of a real party. But such a newspaper could not be published in Tsarist Russia owing to police persecution. Within a month or two at most the Tsar's sleuths would get on its track and smash it. Lenin therefore decided to publish the newspaper abroad. There it was printed on very thin but durable paper and secretly smuggled into Russia. Some of the issues of Iskra were reprinted in Russia by secret printing plants in Baku, Kishinev and Siberia. In the autumn of 1900 Lenin went abroad to make arrangements with the comrades in the Emancipation of Labor group for the publication of a political newspaper on an all-Russian scale. The idea had been worked out by Lenin in all its details while he was in exile. On his way back from exile he had held a number of conferences on the subject in Ufa, Pskov, Moscow and St. Petersburg. Everywhere he made arrangements with the comrades about codes for secret correspondence, addresses to which literature could be sent, and so on, and discussed with them plans for the future struggle. The Tsarist government scented a most dangerous enemy in Lenin. Zubitov, an officer of gendarmes in the Tsarist Okhrana, expressed the opinion in a confidential report that there is nobody bigger than Ulyanov, Lenin, in the revolution today, in view of which he considered it expedient to have Lenin assassinated. Abroad, Lenin came to an arrangement with the Emancipation of Labor group, namely, with Plekhanov, Axelrod and V. Zasulik, for the publication of Iskra under joint auspices. The whole plan of publication from beginning to end had been worked out by Lenin. The first issue of Iskra appeared abroad in December 1900. The title page bore the epigraph, "The spark will kindle a flame." These words were taken from the reply of the Decembrists to the poet Pushkin, who had sent greetings to them in their place of exile in Siberia. And indeed, from the spark, Iskra, started by Lenin, there subsequently flamed up the great revolutionary conflagration in which the Tsarist monarchy of the landed nobility and the power of the bourgeoisie were reduced to ashes. BRIEFSUMMARY. The Marxist Social Democratic Labor Party in Russia was formed in a struggle waged in the first place against Narodism and its views, which were erroneous and harmful to the cause of revolution. Only by ideologically shattering the views of the Narodniks was it possible to clear the way for a Marxist workers' party in Russia. A decisive blow to Narodism was dealt by Plekhanov and his Emancipation of Labor group in the 80s. Lenin completed the ideological defeat of Narodism and dealt it the final blow in the 90s. The Emancipation of Labor group, founded in 1883, did a great deal for the dissemination of Marxism in Russia. It laid the theoretical foundations for social democracy and took the first step to establish connection with the working class movement. With the development of capitalism in Russia, the industrial proletariat rapidly grew in numbers. In the middle of the 80s, the working class adopted the path of organized struggle, of mass action in the form of organized strikes. But the Marxist circles and groups only carried on propaganda and did not realize the necessity for passing to mass agitation among the working class. They therefore still had no practical connection with the working class movement and did not lead it. The St. Petersburg League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, which Lenin formed in 1895 and which started mass agitation among the workers and led mass strikes, marked a new stage. The transition to mass agitation among the workers and the union of Marxism with the working class movement. The St. Petersburg League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class was the rudiment of a revolutionary proletarian party in Russia. The formation of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle was followed by the formation of Marxist organizations in all the principal industrial centers as well as in the border regions. In 1898 at the First Congress of the RSDLP, the first, although unsuccessful, attempt was made to unite the Marxist social democratic organizations into a party. But this Congress did not yet create a party. From Marx to Mao there was neither a party program nor party rules, there was no single leading center, and there was scarcely any connection between the separate Marxist circles and groups. In order to unite and link together the separate Marxist organizations into a single party, Lenin put forward and carried out a plan for the founding of Iskra, the first newspaper of the revolutionary Marxists on an all-Russian scale. The principal opponents to the creation of a single political working-class party at that period were the economists. They denied the necessity for such a party. They fostered the disunity and amateurish methods of the separate groups. It was against them that Lenin and the newspaper Iskra organized by him directed their blows. The appearance of the first issues of Iskra, I-900I, marked a transition to a new period, a period in which a single Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was really formed from the disconnected groups and circles. CHAPTERTWO. Formation of the Russian SOCIALDEMOCRATIC Labor Party, appearance of the Bolshevik and the Menshevik groups within the party, 190-11904. 1. Upsurge of the revolutionary movement in Russia in 1901-04. The end of the 19th century in Europe was marked by an industrial crisis. It soon spread to Russia. During the period of the crisis, 1900-03, about 3,000 large and small enterprises were closed down and over 100,000 workers thrown on the streets. The wages of the workers that remained employed were sharply reduced. The insignificant concessions previously wrung from the capitalists as the result of stubborn economic strikes were now withdrawn. Industrial crisis and unemployment did not halt or weaken the working class movement. On the contrary, the workers' struggle assumed an increasingly revolutionary character. From economic strikes, the workers passed to political strikes, and finally to demonstrations, put forward political demands for democratic liberties, and raised the slogan, "Down with the Tsarist autocracy." A May Day strike at the Obukhov munitions plant in St. Petersburg in 1901 resulted in a bloody encounter between the workers and troops. The only weapons the workers could oppose to the armed forces of the Tsar were stones and lumps of iron. The stubborn resistance of the workers was broken. This was followed by savage reprisals. About 800 workers were arrested, and many were cast into prison or condemned to penal servitude and exile. But the heroic Obukhov defense made a profound impression on the workers of Russia and called forth a wave of sympathy among them. In March 1902, big strikes and a demonstration of workers took place in Batum, organized by the Batum Social Democratic Committee. The Batum demonstration stirred up the workers and peasants of Transcaucasia. In 1902, a big strike broke out in Rostov-on-Don as well. The first to come out were the railwaymen, who were soon joined by the workers of many factories. The strike agitated all the workers. As many as 30,000 would gather at meetings held outside the city limits on several successive days. At these meetings, social democratic proclamations were read aloud and speakers addressed the workers. The police and the Cossacks were powerless to disperse these meetings, attended as they were by many thousands. When several workers were killed by the police, a huge procession of working people attended their funeral on the following day. Only by summoning troops from surrounding cities was the Tsarist government able to suppress the strike. The struggle of the Rostov workers was led by the Don Committee of the RSDLP. The strikes that broke out in 1903 were of even larger dimensions. Mass political strikes took place that year in the south, sweeping Transcaucasia, Baku, Tiflis, Batum, and the large cities of the Ukraine, Odessa, Kiev, Ekaterinoslav. The strikes became increasingly stubborn and better organized. Unlike earlier actions of the working class, the political struggle of the workers was nearly everywhere directed by the social democratic committees. The working class of Russia was rising to wage a revolutionary struggle against the Tsarist regime. The working class movement influenced the peasantry. In the spring and summer of 1902, a peasant movement broke out in the Ukraine, Poltava and Kharkiv provinces, and in the Volga region. The peasants set fire to landlords' mansions, seized their land, and killed the detested zemsky nashalniks, rural prefects, and landlords. Troops were sent to quell the rebellious peasants. Peasants were shot down, hundreds were arrested, and their leaders and organizers were flung into prison, but the revolutionary peasant movement continued to grow. The revolutionary actions of the workers and peasants indicated that revolution was maturing and drawing near in Russia. Under the influence of the revolutionary struggle of the workers, the opposition movement of the students against the government assumed greater intensity. In retaliation for the student demonstrations and strikes, the government shut down the universities, flung hundreds of students into prison, and finally conceived the idea of sending recalcitrant students into the army as common soldiers. In response, the students of all the universities organized a general strike in the winter of 1901–02. About 30,000 students were involved in this strike. The revolutionary movement of the workers and peasants, and especially the reprisals against the students, induced also the liberal bourgeois and the liberal landlords who sat on what was known as the zemstvios to bestir themselves and to raise their voices in protest against the excesses of the Tsarist government in repressing their student sons. The Zemstvo liberals had their stronghold in the Zemstvo boards. These were local government bodies which had charge of purely local affairs affecting the rural population, building of roads, hospitals and schools. The liberal landlords played a fairly prominent part on the Zemstvo boards. They were closely associated with the liberal bourgeois, in fact were almost merged with them, for they themselves were beginning to abandon methods based on survivals of serfdom for capitalist methods of farming on their estates, as being more profitable. Of course, both these groups of liberals supported the Tsarist government, but they were opposed to the excesses of TSRdom, fearing that these excesses would only intensify the revolutionary movement. While they feared the excesses of TSRdom, they feared revolution even more. In protesting against these excesses, the liberals pursued two aims. First, to bring the Tsar to his senses, and secondly, by donning a mask of profound dissatisfaction with TSRdom, to gain the confidence of the people, and to get them, or part of them, to break away from the revolution, and thus undermine its strength. Of course, the Zemstvo liberal movement offered no menace whatever to the existence of TSRdom. Nevertheless, it served to show that all was not well with the eternal pillars of TSRdom. In 1902, the Zemstvo liberal movement led to the formation of the Bourgeois Liberation Group, the nucleus of the future principal party of the bourgeoisie in Russia, the Constitutional Democratic Party. Perceiving that the movement of the workers and peasants was sweeping the country in a formidable torrent, the Tsarist government did everything it could to stem the revolutionary tide. Armed force was used with increasing frequency to suppress the workers' strikes and demonstrations. The bullet and the knout became the government's usual reply to the actions of the workers and peasants. Prisons and places of exile were filled to overflowing. While tightening up the measures of repression, the Tsarist government tried at the same time to resort to other, non-repressive and more flexible measures to divert the workers from the revolutionary movement. Attempts were made to create bogus workers' organizations under the aegis of the gendarmes and police. They were dubbed organizations of police socialism, or Zubetov organizations, after the name of a colonel of gendarmerie, Zubetov, who was the founder of these police-controlled workers' organizations. Through its agents, the Okhrana tried to get the workers to believe that the Tsarist government was itself prepared to assist them in securing the satisfaction of their economic demands. Why engage in politics, why make a revolution, when the Tsar himself is on the side of the workers? Zubetov agents would insinuate to the workers. Zubetov organizations were formed in several cities. On the model of these organizations and with the same purposes in view, an organization known as the Assembly of Russian Factory Workers of St. Petersburg was formed in 1904 by a priest by the name of Gapon. But the attempt of the Tsarist Okhrana to gain control over the working class movement failed. The Tsarist government proved unable by such measures to cope with the growing working class movement. The rising revolutionary movement of the working class swept these police-controlled organizations from its path. 2. Lenin's plan for the building of a Marxist party. Opportunism of the economists. Iskra's fight for Lenin's plan. Lenin's book, What is to be Done? Ideological Foundations of the Marxist Party. Notwithstanding the fact that the first Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Party had been held in 1898, and that it had announced the formation of the party, no real party was as yet created. There was no party program or party rules. The Central Committee of the party elected at the first Congress was arrested and never replaced, for there was nobody to replace it. Worse still, the ideological confusion and lack of organizational cohesion of the party became even more marked after the first Congress. While the years 1884–94 were a period of victory over Narodism and of ideological preparation for the formation of a social democratic party, and the years 1894–98 a period in which an attempt, although unsuccessful, was made to weld the separate Marxist organizations into a social democratic party, the period immediately following 1898 was one of increased ideological and organizational confusion within the party. The victory gained by the Marxists over Narodism and the revolutionary actions of the working class, which proved that the Marxists were right, stimulated the sympathy of the revolutionary youth for Marxism. Marxism became the fashion. This resulted in an influx into the Marxist organizations of throngs of young revolutionary intellectuals, who were weak in theory and inexperienced in political organization, and who had only a vague, and for the most part incorrect, idea of Marxism, derived from the opportunist writings of the legal Marxists, with which the press was filled. This resulted in the lowering of the theoretical and political standard of the Marxist organizations, in their infection with the legal Marxist opportunist tendencies, and in the aggravation of ideological confusion, political vacillation and organizational chaos. The rising tide of the working class movement and the obvious proximity of revolution demanded a united and centralized party of the working class which would be capable of leading the revolutionary movement. But the local party organizations, the local committees, groups and circles were in such a deplorable state, and their organizational disunity and ideological discord so profound, that the task of creating such a party was one of immense difficulty. The difficulty lay not only in the fact that the party had to be built under the fire of savage persecution by the Tsarist government, which every now and then robbed the organizations of their finest workers whom it condemned to exile, imprisonment and penal servitude, but also in the fact that a large number of the local committees and their members would have nothing to do with anything but their local, petty practical activities, did not realize the harm caused by the absence of organizational and ideological unity in the party, were accustomed to the disunity and ideological confusion that prevailed within it, and believed that they could get along quite well without a united centralized party. If a centralized party was to be created, this backwardness, inertia, and narrow outlook of the local bodies had to be overcome. But this was not all. There was a fairly large group of people within the party who had their own press, the Rabashaya Mysl workers. Thought, in Russia and Rabocheye Delo, workers' cause, abroad. And who were trying to justify on theoretical grounds the lack of organizational cohesion and the ideological confusion within the party, frequently even lauding such a state of affairs, and holding that the plan for creating a united and centralized political party of the working class was unnecessary and artificial. These were the economists and their followers. Before a united political party of the proletariat could be created, the economists had to be defeated. It was to this task and to the building of a working class party that Lenin addressed himself. How to begin the building of a united party of the working class was a question on which opinions differed. Some thought that the building of the party should be begun by summoning the Second Congress of the party, which would unite the local organizations and create the party. Lenin was opposed to this. He held that before convening a Congress it was necessary to make the aims and objects of the party clear, to ascertain what sort of a party was wanted, to effect an ideological demarcation from the economists, to tell the party honestly and frankly that there existed two different opinions regarding the aims and objects of the party, the opinion of the economists, and the opinion of the revolutionary social democrats, to start a wide campaign in the press in favor of the views of revolutionary social democracy, just as the economists were conducting a campaign in their own press in favor of their own views, and to give the local organizations the opportunity to make a deliberate choice between these two trends. Only after this indispensable preliminary work had been done could a party Congress be summoned. Lenin put it plainly. Before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all draw firm and definite lines of demarcation. Lenin. Selected Works, Volume 2, page 45. Lenin accordingly held that the building of a political party of the working class should be begun by the founding of a militant political newspaper on an all-Russian scale, which would carry on propaganda and agitation in favor of the views of revolutionary social democracy. That the establishment of such a newspaper should be the first step in the building of the party. In his well-known article, Where to Begin, Lenin outlined a concrete plan for the building of the party, a plan which was later expanded in his famous work What is to be Done. In our opinion, wrote Lenin in this article, the starting point of our activities, the first practical step towards creating the organization desired, finally, the main thread following which we would be able to develop, deepen and expand that organization unswervingly, should be the establishment of a political newspaper on an all-Russian scale. Without it we cannot systematically carry on that all-embracing propaganda and agitation, consistent in principle, which form the chief and constant task of social democrats in general, and the particularly urgent task of the present moment when that is, the formation of a party. Ed. Interest in politics, in questions of socialism, has been aroused among the widest sections of the population. Ibid. Page 19. Lenin considered that such a newspaper would serve not only to weld the party ideologically, but also to unite the local bodies within the party organizationally. The network of agents and correspondents of the newspaper, representing the local organizations, would provide a skeleton around which the party could be built up organizationally. 4. Lenin said, a newspaper is not only a collective propagandist and collective agitator, but also a collective organizer. This network of agents, writes Lenin in the same article, will form the skeleton of precisely the organization we need, namely, one that is sufficiently large to embrace the whole country, sufficiently wide and many-sided to effect a strict and detailed division of labor, sufficiently tried and tempered to be able unswervingly to carry on its own work under all circumstances, at all turns, and in all contingencies, sufficiently flexible to be able to avoid open battle against an enemy of overwhelming strength, when he has concentrated all his forces at one spot, and yet able to take advantage of the awkwardness of this enemy and to attack him whenever and wherever least expected. Ibid. pp. 21-2. Iskra was to be such a newspaper. And Iskra did indeed become such a political newspaper on an all-Russian scale which prepared the way for the ideological and organizational consolidation of the party. As to the structure and composition of the party itself, Lenin considered that it should consist of two parts. A close circle of regular cadres of leading party workers, chiefly professional revolutionaries, that is, party workers free from all occupation except party work and possessing the necessary minimum of theoretical knowledge, political experience, organizational practice and the art of combating the Tsarist police and of eluding them, and B, a broad network of local party organizations and a large number of party members enjoying the sympathy and support of hundreds of thousands of working people. I assert, Lenin wrote, 1. That no revolutionary movement can endure without a stable organization of leaders that maintains continuity. 2. That the wider the masses spontaneously drawn into the struggle, the more urgent the need of such an organization, and the more solid this organization must be. 3. That such an organization must consist chiefly of people professionally engaged in revolutionary activity. 4. That in an autocratic state the more we confine the membership of such organization to people who are professionally engaged in revolutionary activity and who have been professionally trained in the art of combating the political police, the more difficult will it be to wipe out such an organization, and 5. The greater will be the number of people of the working class and of the other classes of society who will be able to join the movement and perform active work in it. Ibid. pp. 138-39. As to the character of the party that was being built up and its role in relation to the working class, as well as its aims and objects, Lenin held that the party should form the vanguard of the working class, that it should be the guiding force of the working class movement, coordinating and directing the class struggle of the proletariat. The ultimate goal of the party was the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of socialism. Its immediate aim was the overthrow of TSRdom and the establishment of a democratic order. And inasmuch as the overthrow of capitalism was impossible without the preliminary overthrow of TSRdom, the principal task of the party at the given moment was to rouse the working class and the whole people for a struggle against TSRdom, to develop a revolutionary movement of the people against it, and to overthrow it as the first and serious obstacle in the path of socialism. History, Lenin wrote, has now confronted us with an immediate task which is the most revolutionary of all the immediate tasks that confront the proletariat of any country. The fulfillment of this task, the destruction of the most powerful bulwark not only of European but also, it may now be said, of Asiatic reaction would make the Russian proletariat the vanguard of the international revolutionary proletariat. Ibid. Page 50. And further, we must bear in mind that the struggle with the government for partial demands, the winning of partial concessions, are only petty skirmishes with the enemy, petty encounters on the outposts, whereas the decisive engagement is still to come. Before us, in all its strength, stands the enemy's fortress, which is raining shot and shell upon us and mowing down our best fighters. We must capture this fortress, and we shall capture it if we unite all the forces of the awakening proletariat with all the forces of the Russian revolutionaries into one party, which will attract all that is alive and honest in Russia. And only then will the great prophecy of Pyotr Alekseev, the Russian worker revolutionary, be fulfilled. The muscular arm of the working millions will be lifted, and the yoke of despotism from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution guarded by the soldiers' bayonets, will be smashed to atoms. Lenin, Collected Works, Russ, ed. Volume IV, page 59. Such was Lenin's plan for the creation of a party of the working class in autocratic Tsarist Russia. The economists showed no delay in launching an attack on Lenin's plan. They asserted that the general political struggle against TSRdom was a matter for all classes, but primarily for the bourgeoisie, and that therefore it was of no serious interest to the working class, for the chief interest of the workers lay in the economic struggle against the employers for higher wages, better working conditions, etc. The primary and immediate aim of the Social Democrats should therefore be not a political struggle against TSRdom, and not the overthrow of TSRdom, but the organization of the economic struggle of the workers against the employers and the government. By the economic struggle against the government they meant a struggle for better factory legislation. The economists claimed that in this way it would be possible to lend the economic struggle itself a political character. The economists no longer dared openly to contest the need for a political party of the working class. But they considered that it should not be the guiding force of the working class movement, that it should not interfere in the spontaneous movement of the working class, let alone direct it, but that it should follow in the wake of this movement, study it and draw lessons from it. The economists furthermore asserted that the role of the conscious element in the working class movement, the organizing and directing role of socialist consciousness and socialist theory, was insignificant, or almost insignificant, that the Social Democrats should not elevate the minds of the workers to the level of socialist consciousness, but, on the contrary, should adjust themselves and descend to the level of the average, or even of the more backward sections of the working class, and that the Social Democrats should not try to impart a socialist consciousness to the working class, but should wait until the spontaneous movement of the working class arrived of itself at a socialist consciousness. As regards Lenin's plan for the organization of the party, the economists regarded it almost as an act of violence against the spontaneous movement. In the columns of Iskra, and especially in his celebrated work What is to be Done, Lenin launched a vehement attack against this opportunist philosophy of the economists and demolished it. 1. Lenin showed that to divert the working class from the general political struggle against TSRDM and to confine its task to that of the economic struggle against the employers and the government, while leaving both employers and government intact, meant to condemn the workers to eternal slavery. The economic struggle of the workers against the employers and the government was a trade union struggle for better terms in the sale of their labor power to the capitalists. The workers, however, wanted to fight not only for better terms in the sale of their labor power to the capitalists, but also for the abolition of the capitalist system itself, which condemned them to sell their labor power to the capitalists and to suffer exploitation. But the workers could not develop their struggle against capitalism, their struggle for socialism to the full, as long as the path of the working class movement was barred by TSRDM, that watchdog of capitalism. It was therefore the immediate task of the party and of the working class to remove TSRDM from the path and thus clear the way to socialism. 2. Lenin showed that to extol the spontaneous process in the working class movement, to deny that the party had a leading role to play, to reduce its role to that of a recorder of events, meant to preach Khvostism, following in the tail, to preach the conversion of the party into a tall piece of the spontaneous process, into a passive force of the movement, capable only of contemplating the spontaneous process and allowing events to take their own course. To advocate this meant working for the destruction of the party, that is, leaving the working class without a party, that is, leaving the working class unarmed. But to leave the working class unarmed when it was faced by such enemies as TSRDM, which was armed to the teeth, and the bourgeoisie, which was organized on modern lines and had its own party to direct its struggle against the working class, meant to betray the working class. 3. Lenin showed that to bow in worship of the spontaneous working class movement and to belittle the importance of consciousness, of socialist consciousness and socialist theory, meant, in the first place, to insult the workers, who were drawn to consciousness as to light, in the second place, to lower the value of theory in the eyes of the party, that is, to depreciate the instrument which helped the party to understand the present and foresee the future, and, in the third place, it meant to sink completely and irrevocably into the bog of opportunism. Without a revolutionary theory, Lenin said, there can be no revolutionary movement. The role of vanguard can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by the most advanced theory. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 2, pp. 47-48. 4. Lenin showed that the economists were deceiving the working class when they asserted that a socialist ideology could arise from the spontaneous movement of the working class, for in reality the socialist ideology arises not from the spontaneous movement, but from science. By denying the necessity of imparting a socialist consciousness to the working class, the economists were clearing the way for bourgeois ideology, facilitating its introduction and dissemination among the working class, and, consequently, they were burying the idea of union between the working class movement and socialism, thus helping the bourgeoisie. All worship of the spontaneity of the labor movement, Lenin said, all belittling of the role of the conscious element, of the role of the Party of Social Democracy, means, altogether irrespective of whether the belittler likes it or not, strengthening the influence of the bourgeois ideology among the workers. Ibid. Page 61. And further, the only choice is either the bourgeois or the socialist ideology. There is no middle course. Hence, to belittle the socialist ideology in any way, to turn away from it in the slightest degree, means to strengthen the bourgeois ideology. Ibid. Page 62. 5. Summing up all these mistakes of the economists, Lenin came to the conclusion that they did not want a party of social revolution for the emancipation of the working class from capitalism, but a party of social reform, which presupposed the preservation of capitalist rule, and that, consequently, the economists were reformists who were betraying the fundamental interests of the proletariat. 6. Lastly, Lenin showed that economism was not an accidental phenomenon in Russia, but that the economists were an instrument of bourgeois influence upon the working class, that they had allies in the West European social democratic parties in the person of the revisionists, the followers of the opportunist Bernstein. The opportunist trend in social democratic parties was gaining strength in Western Europe. On the plea of freedom to criticize Marx, it demanded a revision of the Marxist doctrine, hence the term revisionism. It demanded renunciation of the revolution, of socialism and of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin showed that the Russian economists were pursuing a similar policy of renunciation of the revolutionary struggle, of socialism and of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Such were the main theoretical principles expounded by Lenin in What is to be Done. As a result of the wide circulation of this book, by the time of the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Party, that is, within a year after its publication, it appeared in March 1902, nothing but a distasteful memory remained of the ideological stand of economism, and to be called an economist was regarded by the majority of the members of the party as an insult. It was a complete ideological defeat for economism, for the ideology of opportunism, Khvostism and spontaneity. But this does not exhaust the significance of Lenin's What is to be done? The historic significance of this celebrated book lies in the fact that in it Lenin 1. For the first time in the history of Marxist thought, laid bare the ideological roots of opportunism, showing that they principally consisted in worshipping the spontaneous working class movement and belittling the role of socialist consciousness in the working class movement. 2. Brought out the great importance of theory, of consciousness, and of the party as a revolutionizing and guiding force of the spontaneous working class movement. 3. Brilliantly substantiated the fundamental Marxist thesis that a Marxist party is a union of the working class movement with socialism. 4. Gave a brilliant exposition of the ideological foundations of a Marxist party. The theoretical theses expounded in What is to be done later became the foundation of the ideology of the Bolshevik Party. Possessing such a wealth of theory, Iskra was able to, and actually did, develop an extensive campaign for Lenin's plan for the building of the party, for mustering its forces, for calling the Second Party Congress, for revolutionary social democracy, and against the economists, revisionists, and opportunists of all kinds. One of the most important things that Iskra did was to draft a program for the party. The program of a workers' party, as we know, is a brief, scientifically formulated statement of the aims and objects of the struggle of the working class. The program defines both the ultimate goal of the revolutionary movement of the proletariat and the demands for which the party fights while on the way to the achievement of the ultimate goal. The drafting of a program was therefore a matter of prime importance. During the drafting of the program, serious differences arose on the editorial board of Iskra between Lenin, on the one hand, and Plekhanov and other members of the board, on the other. November. But matters did not come to a head at that time. Lenin secured the inclusion in the draft program of a most important clause on the dictatorship of the proletariat and of a clear statement on the leading role of the working class in the revolution. It was Lenin, too, who drew up the whole agrarian section of the program. Already at that time Lenin was in favor of the nationalization of the land, but he considered it necessary in the first stage of the struggle to put forward the demand for the return to the peasants of the Otreski, that is, those portions of the land which had been cut off the peasants' land by the landlords at the time of emancipation of the peasants. Plekhanov was opposed to the demand for the nationalization of the land. The disputes between Lenin and Plekhanov over the party program to some extent determined the future differences between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. 3. Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Adoption of program and rules and formation of a single party. Differences at the Congress. And appearance of two trends within the party, the Bolshevik and the Menshevik. Thus, the triumph of Lenin's principles and the successful struggle waged by Iskra for Lenin's plan of organization brought about all the principal conditions necessary for the creation of a party, or, as it was said at the time, of a real party. The Iskra trend gained the upper hand among the social democratic organizations in Russia. The Second Party Congress could now be summoned. The Second Congress of the RSDLP opened on July 17, 30. New Style, 1903. It was held abroad, in secret. It first met in Brussels, but the Belgian police requested the delegates to leave the country. Thereupon the Congress transferred its sittings to London. 43 delegates in all, representing 26 organizations, assembled at the Congress. Each committee was entitled to send 2 delegates, but some of them sent only 1. The 43 delegates commanded 51 votes between them. The chief purpose of the Congress was to create a real party on that basis of principles and organization which had been advanced and elaborated by Iskra. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 2, page 412. The composition of the Congress was heterogeneous. The avowed economists were not represented because of the defeat they had suffered. But they had since disguised their views so artfully that they managed to smuggle several of their delegates into the Congress. Moreover, the Bund delegates differed only ostensibly from the economists. In reality they supported the economists. Thus the Congress was attended not only by supporters of Iskra, but also by its adversaries. 33 of the delegates, that is, the majority, were supporters of Iskra. But not all those who considered themselves Iskra ISDS were real Leninist Iskra ISDS. The delegates fell into several groups. The supporters of Lenin, or the firm Iskra ISDS, commanded 24 votes. 9 of the Iskra ISDS followed Martov. These were unstable Iskrists. Some of the delegates vacillated between Iskra and its opponents. They commanded 10 votes and constituted the center. The avowed opponents of Iskra commanded 8 votes, 3 economists and 5 Bundists. A split in the ranks of the Iskra ISDS would be enough to give the enemies of Iskra the upper hand. It will therefore be seen how complex the situation was at the Congress. Lenin expended a great deal of energy to ensure the victory of Iskra. The most important item on the agenda was the adoption of the party program. The chief point which, during the discussion of the program, aroused the objections of the opportunist section of the Congress was the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat. There were a number of other items in the program on which the opportunists did not agree with the revolutionary section of the Congress. But they decided to put up the main fight on the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat on the plea that the programs of a number of foreign social democratic parties contained no clause on the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that therefore the program of the Russian Social Democratic Party could dispense with it too. The opportunists also objected to the inclusion in the party program of demands on the peasant question. These people did not want revolution. They, therefore, fought shy of the ally of the working class, the peasantry, and adopted an unfriendly attitude towards it. The Bundists and the Polish Social Democrats objected to the right of nations to self-determination. Lenin had always taught that the working class must combat national oppression. To object to the inclusion of this demand in the program was tantamount to a proposal to renounce proletarian internationalism and to become accomplices in national oppression. Lenin made short work of all these objections. The Congress adopted the program proposed by Iskra. This program consisted of two parts, a maximum program and a minimum program. The maximum program dealt with the principal aim of the working class party, namely, the socialist revolution, the overthrow of the power of the capitalists, and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The minimum program dealt with the immediate aims of the party, aims to be achieved before the overthrow of the capitalist system and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, namely, the overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy, the establishment of a democratic republic, the introduction of an 8-hour working day, the abolition of all survivals of serfdom in the countryside, and the restoration to the peasants of the cut-off lands, Otrezki, of which they had been deprived by the landlords. Subsequently, the Bolsheviks replaced the demand for the return of the Otrezki by the demand for the confiscation of all the landed estates. The program adopted by the Second Congress was a revolutionary program of the Party of the Working Class. It remained in force until the Eighth Party Congress, held after the victory of the Proletarian Revolution, when our party adopted a new program. Having adopted the program, the Second Party Congress proceeded to discuss the draft of the party rules. Now that the Congress had adopted a program and had laid the foundation for the ideological unity of the party, it had also to adopt party rules so as to put an end to amateurishness and the parochial outlook of the circles, to organizational disunity and the absence of strict discipline in the party. The adoption of the program had gone through comparatively smoothly, but fierce disputes arose at the Congress over the party rules. The sharpest differences arose over the formulation of the first paragraph of the rules, dealing with party membership. Who could be a member of the party? What was to be the composition of the party? What was to be the organizational nature of the party? An organized whole or something amorphous? Such were the questions that arose in connection with the first paragraph of the rules. Two different formulations contested the ground. Lenin's formulation, which was supported by Plekhanov and the firm Iskra ISDS, and Martov's formulation, which was supported by Axelrod, Zasulik, the unstable Iskra ISDS, Trotsky, and all the avowed opportunists at the Congress. According to Lenin's formulation, one could be a member of the party who accepted its program, supported it financially, and belonged to one of its organizations. Martov's formulation, while admitting that acceptance of the program and financial support of the party were indispensable conditions of party membership, did not, however, make it a condition that a party member should belong to one of the party organizations, maintaining that a party member need not necessarily belong to a party organization. Lenin regarded the party as an organized detachment, whose members cannot just enroll themselves in the party, but must be admitted into the party by one of its organizations, and hence must submit to party discipline. Martov, on the other hand, regarded the party as something organizationally amorphous, whose members enroll themselves in the party and are therefore not obliged to submit to party discipline, inasmuch as they do not belong to a party organization. Thus, unlike Lenin's formulation, Martov's formulation would throw the door of the party wide open to unstable non-proletarian elements. On the eve of the bourgeois democratic revolution, there were people among the bourgeois intelligentsia who for a while sympathized with the revolution. From time to time they might even render some small service to the party. But such people would not join an organization, submit to party discipline, carry out party tasks and run the accompanying risks. Yet Martov and the other Mensheviks proposed to regard such people as party members, and to accord them the right and opportunity to influence party affairs. They even proposed to grant any striker the right to enroll himself in the party, although non-socialists. Anarchists and socialist revolutionaries also took part in strikes. And so it was that instead of a monolithic and militant party with a clearly defined organization, for which Lenin and the Leninists fought at the Congress, the Martovites wanted a heterogeneous and loose, amorphous party, which could not be a militant party with firm discipline because of its heterogeneous character, if for no other reason. The breaking away of the unstable Iskra ISDS from the firm Iskrists, their alliance with the centrists, joined as they were by the avowed opportunists, turned the balance in favor of Martov on this point. By 28 votes to 22, with one abstention, the Congress adopted Martov's formulation of the first paragraph of the rules. After the split in the ranks of the Iskra ISDS over the first paragraph of the rules, the struggle at the Congress became still more acute. The Congress was coming to the last item on the agenda, the elections of the leading institutions of the party, the editorial board of the central organ of the party, Iskra, and the Central Committee. However, before the elections were reached, certain incidents occurred which changed the alignment of forces. In connection with the party rules, the Congress had to deal with the question of the Bund. The Bund laid claim to a special position within the party. It demanded to be recognized as the sole representative of the Jewish workers in Russia. To comply with this demand would have meant to divide the workers in the party organizations according to nationality, and to renounce common territorial class organizations of the workers. The Congress rejected the system of organization on national lines proposed by the Bund. Thereupon the Bundists quit the Congress. 2 economists also left the Congress when the latter refused to recognize their foreign league as the representative of the party abroad. The departure of these 7 opportunists altered the balance of forces at the Congress in favor of the Leninists. From the very outset, Lenin focused his attention on the composition of the central institutions of the party. He deemed it necessary that the Central Committee should be composed of staunch and consistent revolutionaries. The Mardovites strove to secure the predominance of unstable, opportunist elements on the Central Committee. The majority of the Congress supported Lenin on this question. The Central Committee that was elected consisted of Lenin's followers. On Lenin's proposal, Lenin, Plekhanov and Martov were elected to the editorial board of Iskra. Martov had demanded the election of all the 6 former members of the Iskra editorial board, the majority of whom were Martov's followers. This demand was rejected by the majority of the Congress. The 3 proposed by Lenin were elected. Martov thereupon announced that he would not join the editorial board of the central organ. Thus, by its vote on the central institutions of the party, the Congress sealed the defeat of Martov's followers and the victory of Lenin's followers. From that time on, Lenin's followers, who received the majority of votes in the elections at the Congress, have been called Bolsheviks, from Bolshinstvo, majority, and Lenin's opponents, who received the minority of votes, have been called Mensheviks, from Menshinstvo, minority. Summing up the work of the Second Congress, the following conclusions may be drawn. 1. The Congress sealed the victory of Marxism over economism, over open opportunism. 2. The Congress adopted a program and rules, created the Social Democratic Party, and thus built the framework of a single party. 3. The Congress revealed the existence of grave differences over questions of organization which divided the party into 2 sections, the from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution, Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, of whom the former championed the organizational principles of revolutionary social democracy, while the latter sank into the bog of organizational looseness and of opportunism. 4. The Congress showed that the place of the old opportunists, the economists, who had already been defeated by the party, was being taken by new opportunists, the Mensheviks. 5. The Congress did not prove equal to its task in matters of organization, showed vacillation, and at times even gave the preponderance to the Mensheviks. And although it corrected its position towards the end, it was nevertheless unable to expose the opportunism of the Mensheviks on matters of organization and to isolate them in the party, or even to put such a task before the party. This latter circumstance proved one of the main reasons why the struggle between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, far from subsiding after the Congress, became even more acute. 4. Splitting activities of the Menshevik leaders and sharpening of the struggle within the party after the Second Congress. Opportunism of the Mensheviks. Lenin's book, 1 Step Forward, 2 Steps Back, Organizational Principles of the Marxist Party. After the Second Congress, the struggle within the party became even more acute. The Mensheviks did their utmost to frustrate the decisions of the Second Congress and to seize the central institutions of the party. They demanded that their representatives be included in the editorial board of Iskra and in the Central Committee in such numbers as would give them a majority on the editorial board and parity with the Bolsheviks on the Central Committee. As this ran directly counter to the decisions of the Second Congress, the Bolsheviks rejected the Mensheviks' demand. Thereupon the Mensheviks, secretly from the party, created their own anti-party factional organization, headed by Martov, Trotsky and Axelrod, and, as Martov wrote, broke into revolt against Leninism. The methods they adopted for combating the party were, as Lenin expressed it, to disorganize the whole party work, damage the cause, and hamper all and everything. They entrenched themselves in the Foreign League of Russian Social Democrats, 9/10 of whom were émigré intellectuals isolated from the work in Russia, and from this position they opened fire on the party, on Lenin and the Leninists. The Mensheviks received considerable help from Plekhanov. At the Second Congress, Plekhanov sided with Lenin. But after the Second Congress, he allowed the Mensheviks to intimidate him with threats of a split. He decided to make peace with the Mensheviks at all costs. It was the deadweight of his earlier opportunist mistakes that dragged Plekhanov down to the Mensheviks. From an advocate of reconciliation with the opportunist Mensheviks, he soon became a Menshevik himself. Plekhanov demanded that all the former Menshevik editors of the Iskra who had been rejected by the Congress be included in the editorial board. Lenin, of course, could not agree to this and resigned from the Iskra editorial board in order to entrench himself in the Central Committee of the party and to strike at the opportunists from this position. Acting by himself, and in defiance of the will of the Congress, Plekhanov co-opted the former Menshevik editors to the editorial board of Iskra. From that moment on, beginning with the 52nd issue of Iskra, the Mensheviks converted it into their own organ and began to propagate their opportunist views in its columns. Ever since then, Lenin's Bolshevik Iskra has been known in the party as the old Iskra, and the Menshevik, opportunist Iskra as the new Iskra. When it passed into the hands of the Mensheviks, Iskra became a weapon in the fight against Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and an organ for the propaganda of Menshevik opportunism, primarily on questions of organization. Joining forces with the economists and the Bundists, the Mensheviks started a campaign in the columns of Iskra, as they said, against Leninism. Plekhanov could not stick to his position as an advocate of conciliation, and soon he too joined the campaign. This was bound to happen by the very logic of things. Whoever insists on a conciliatory attitude towards opportunists is bound to sink to opportunism himself. There began to flow from the columns of the new Iskra, as from a cornucopia, articles and statements claiming that the party ought not to be an organized whole, that free groups and individuals should be allowed within its ranks without any obligation to submit to the decisions of its organs, that every intellectual who sympathized with the party, as well as every striker, and every participant in a demonstration, should be allowed to declare himself a party member, that the demand for obedience to all the decisions of the party was formal and bureaucratic, that the demand that the minority must submit to the majority meant the mechanical suppression of the will of party members, that the demand that all party members, both leaders and rank and filers, ism but anarchist autonomism, which would permit individuals in party organizations not to obey the decisions of the party. This was unbridled propaganda of organizational license, which would undermine the party principle and party discipline. It was glorification of the individualism of the intelligentsia, and a justification of the anarchist contempt of discipline. The Mensheviks were obviously trying to drag the party back from the Second Congress to the old organizational disunity, to the old parochial outlook of the circles and the old amateurish methods. A vigorous rebuff had to be given the Mensheviks. This rebuff was administered by Lenin in his celebrated book, 1 Step Forward, 2 Steps Back, published in May 1904. The following are the main organizational principles which Lenin expounded in his book, and which afterwards came to form the organizational foundations of the Bolshevik Party. 1. The Marxist Party is a detachment of the working class. But the working class has many detachments, and hence not every detachment of the working class can be called a party of the working class. The party differs from other detachments of the working class primarily by the fact that it is not an ordinary detachment, but the vanguard detachment, a class-conscious detachment, a Marxist detachment of the working class, armed with a knowledge of the life of society, of the laws of its development and of the laws of the class struggle, and for this reason able to lead the working class and to direct its struggle. The party must therefore not be confused with the working class, as the part must not be confused with the whole. One cannot demand that every striker be allowed to call himself a member of the party, for whoever confuses party and class lowers the level of consciousness of the party to that of every striker, destroys the party as the class-conscious vanguard of the working class. It is not the task of the party to lower its level to that of every striker, but to elevate the masses of the workers, to elevate every striker to the level of the party. We are the party of a class, Lenin wrote, and therefore almost the entire class, and in times of war, in the period of civil war, the entire class should act under the leadership of our party, should adhere to our party as closely as possible. But it would be Manilovism, smug complacency, and Kavostism, following in the tail, to think that at any time under capitalism the entire class, or almost the entire class, would be able to rise to the level of consciousness and activity of its vanguard, of its social democratic party. No sensible social democrat has ever yet doubted that under capitalism even the trade union organizations, which are more primitive and more comprehensible to the undeveloped strata, are unable to embrace the entire, or almost the entire working class. To forget the distinction between the vanguard and the whole of the masses which gravitate towards it, to forget the constant duty of the vanguard to raise ever wider strata to this most advanced level, means merely to deceive oneself, to shut one's eyes to the immensity of our tasks, and to narrow down these tasks. Lenin, Collected Works, Russ, ed. Volume V, pp. 205-06. 2. The party is not only the vanguard, the class-conscious detachment of the working class, but also an organized detachment of the working class, with its own discipline, which is binding on its members. Hence party members must necessarily be members of some organization of the party. If the party were not an organized detachment of the class, not a system of organization, but a mere agglomeration of persons who declare themselves to be party members but do not belong to any party organization and therefore are not organized, hence not obliged to obey party decisions, the party would never have a united will, it could never achieve the united action of its members, and, consequently, it would be unable to direct the struggle of the working class. The party can lead the practical struggle of the working class and direct it towards one aim only if all its members are organized in one common detachment, welded together by unity of will, unity of action and unity of discipline. The objection raised by the Mensheviks that in that case many intellectuals, for example, professors, university and high school students, etc., would remain outside the ranks of the party, since they would not want to join any of the organizations of the party, either because they shrink from party discipline, or, as Plekhanov said at the Second Congress, because they consider it beneath their dignity to join some local organization. This Menshevik objection recoiled on the heads of the Mensheviks themselves, for the party does not need members who shrink from party discipline and fear to join the party organization. Workers did not fear discipline and organization, and they willingly join the organization if they have made up their minds to be party members. It is the individualistic intellectuals who fear discipline and organization, and they would indeed remain outside the ranks of the party. But that was all to the good, for the party would be spared that influx of unstable elements, which had become particularly marked at that time, when the bourgeois democratic revolution was on the upgrade. When I say, Lenin wrote, that the party should be a sum, and not a mere arithmetical sum, but a complex of organizations. I thereby express clearly and precisely my wish, my demand, that the party, as the vanguard of the class, should be as organized as possible, that the party should admit to its ranks only such elements as lend themselves to at least a minimum of organization. Ibid. Page 203. And further, Martov's formulation ostensibly defends the interests of the broad strata of the proletariat, but in fact, it serves the interests of the bourgeois intellectuals, who fight shy of proletarian discipline and organization. No one will undertake to deny that it is precisely its individualism and incapacity for discipline and organization that in general distinguish the intelligentsia as a separate stratum of modern capitalist society. Ibid. Page 212. And again, the proletariat is not afraid of organization and discipline. The proletariat will do nothing to have the worthy professors and high school students, who do not want to join an organization, recognized as party members merely because they work under the control of an organization. It is not the proletariat, but certain intellectuals in our party who lack self-training in the spirit of organization and discipline. Ibid. Page 307. 3. The party is not merely an organized detachment, but the highest of all forms of organization, of the working class, and it is its mission to guide all the other organizations of the working class. As the highest form of organization, consisting of the finest members of the class, armed with an advanced theory, with knowledge of the laws of the class struggle and with the experience of the revolutionary movement, the party has every opportunity of guiding, and is obliged to guide, all the other organizations of the working class. The attempt of the Mensheviks to belittle and depreciate the leading role of the party tends to weaken all the other organizations of the proletariat which are guided by the party, and, consequently, to weaken and disarm the proletariat, for, in its struggle for power the proletariat has no other weapon but organization. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 2, page 466. 4. The party is an embodiment of the connection of the vanguard of the working class with the working class millions. However fine a vanguard the party may be, and however well it may be organized, it cannot exist and develop without connections with the non-party masses, and without multiplying and strengthening these connections. A party which shuts itself up in its own shell, isolates itself from the masses, and loses, or even relaxes, its connections with its class is bound to lose the confidence and support of the masses, and, consequently, is surely bound to perish. In order to live to the full and to develop, the party must multiply its connections with the masses and win the confidence of the millions of its class. In order to be a social democratic party, Lenin said, we must win the support precisely of the class. Lenin, Collected Works, Russ. Ed. Volume. V. P. 208. 5. In order to function properly and to guide the masses systematically, the party must be organized on the principle of centralism, having one set of rules and uniform party discipline, one leading organ, the Party Congress, and in the intervals between Congresses, the Central Committee of the Party. The minority must submit to the majority, the various organizations must submit to the center, and lower organizations to higher organizations. Following these conditions, the party of the working class cannot be a real party and cannot carry out its tasks in guiding the class. Of course, as under the Tsarist autocracy the party existed illegally, the party organizations could not in those days be built up on the principle of election from below, and as a consequence, the party had to be strictly conspiratorial. But Lenin considered that this temporary feature in the life of our party would at once lapse with the elimination of TSRdom, when the party would become open and legal, and the party organizations would be built up on the principles of democratic elections, of democratic centralism. Formerly, Lenin wrote, our party was not a formally organized whole, but only the sum of separate groups, and, therefore, no other relations except those of ideological influence were possible between these groups. Now we have become an organized party, and this implies the establishment of authority, the transformation of the power of ideas into the power of authority, the subordination of lower party bodies to higher party bodies. Ibid. Page 291. Accusing the Mensheviks of organizational nihilism and of aristocratic anarchism which would not submit to the authority of the party in its discipline, Lenin wrote. This aristocratic anarchism is particularly characteristic of the Russian nihilist. He thinks of the party organization as a monstrous factory. He regards the subordination of the part to the whole and of the minority to the majority as serfdom, division of labor. Under the direction of a center evokes from him a tragi-comical outcry against people being transformed into wheels and cogs. To turn editors into contributors being considered a particularly atrocious species of such transformation. Mention of the organizational rules of the party calls forth a contemptuous grimace and the disdainful remark, intended for the formalists, that one could very well dispense with rules altogether. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 2, pp. 442-43. 6. In its practical work, if it wants to preserve the unity of its ranks, the party must impose a common proletarian discipline, equally binding on all party members, both leaders and rank and file. Therefore there should be no division within the party into the chosen few, on whom discipline is not binding, and the many, on whom discipline is binding. If this condition is not observed, the integrity of the party and the unity of its ranks cannot be maintained. The complete absence of sensible arguments on the part of Martov and company against the editorial board appointed by the Congress, Lenin wrote, is best of all shown by their own catchword, "We are not serfs." The mentality of the bourgeois intellectual, who regards himself as one of the chosen few, standing above mass organization and mass discipline, is expressed here with remarkable clarity. It seems to the individualism of the intelligentsia that all proletarian organization and discipline is serfdom. Lenin. Collected Works, Russ. ed. Volume 6, page 282. And further, as we proceed with the building of a real party, the class-conscious worker must learn to distinguish the mentality of the soldier of the proletarian army from the mentality of the bourgeois intellectual who makes a display of anarchist phraseology. He must learn to demand that the duties of a party member be fulfilled not only by the rank and filers, but by the people at the top, as well. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 2, pp. 445-46. Summing up his analysis of the differences, and defining the position of the Mensheviks as opportunism in matters of organization, Lenin considered that one of the gravest sins of Menshevism lay in its underestimation of the importance of party organization as a weapon of the proletariat in the struggle for its emancipation. The Mensheviks held that the party organization of the proletariat was of no great importance for the victory of the revolution. Contrary to the Mensheviks, Lenin held that the ideological unity of the proletariat alone was not enough for victory. If victory was to be won, ideological unity would have to be consolidated by the material unity of organization of the proletariat. Only on this condition, Lenin considered, could the proletariat become an invincible force. In its struggle for power, Lenin wrote, the proletariat has no other weapon but organization. Disunited by the rule of anarchic competition in the bourgeois world, ground down by forced labor for capital, constantly thrust back to the lower depths of utter destitution, savagery and degeneration, the proletariat can become, and inevitably will become, an invincible force only when its ideological unification by the principles of Marxism is consolidated by the material unity of an organization which will weld millions of toilers into an army of the working class. Neither the decrepit rule of Russian TSRdom, nor the senile rule of international capital will be able to withstand this army. Ibid. Page 466. With these prophetic words Lenin concludes his book. Such were the fundamental organizational principles set forth by Lenin in his famous book, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. The importance of this book lies primarily in the fact that it successfully upheld the party principle against the circle principle, and the party against the disorganizers, that it smashed the opportunism of the Mensheviks on questions of organization, and laid the organizational foundations of the Bolshevik Party. But this does not exhaust its significance. Its historic significance lies in the fact that in it Lenin, for the first time in the history of Marxism, elaborated the doctrine of the party as the leading organization of the proletariat, as the principal weapon of the proletariat, without which the struggle for the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be won. The circulation of Lenin's book, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, among the party workers led the majority of the local organizations to rally to the side of Lenin. But the more closely the organizations rallied around the Bolsheviks, the more malicious became the behavior of the Menshevik leaders. In the summer of 1904, thanks to Plekhanov's assistance and the treachery of Krasin and Noskov, two demoralized Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks captured the majority on the Central Committee. It was obvious that the Mensheviks were working for a split. The loss of Iskra and of the Central Committee put the Bolsheviks in a difficult position. It became necessary for them to organize their own Bolshevik newspaper. It became necessary to make arrangements for a new party congress, the Third Congress, so as to set up a new central committee and to settle accounts with the Mensheviks. And this is what the Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, set to work to do. The Bolsheviks started a campaign for the summoning of the Third Party Congress. In August 1904, under Lenin's guidance, a conference of 22 Bolsheviks was held in Switzerland. The conference adopted an appeal addressed to the party. This appeal served the Bolsheviks as a program in their struggle for the summoning of the Third Congress. At 3 regional conferences of Bolshevik committees, Southern, Caucasian and Northern, a bureau of committees of the majority was elected, which undertook the practical preparations for the Third Party Congress. On January 4, 1905, the first issue of the Bolshevik newspaper, Forward, appeared. Thus 2 separate groups arose within the party, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, each with its own central body and its own press. BRIEFSUMMARY. In the period 1901–04, with the growth of the revolutionary working class movement, the Marxist social democratic organizations in Russia grew and gained strength. In the stubborn struggle over principles, waged against the economists, the revolutionary line of Lenin's Iskra gained the victory, and the ideological confusion and amateurish methods of work were overcome. Iskra linked up the scattered social democratic circles and groups and prepared the way for the convocation of the Second Party Congress. At the Second Congress, held in 1903, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was formed, a party program and rules were adopted, and the central leading organs of the party were set up. In the struggle waged at the Second Congress for the complete victory of the Iskra trend in the RSDLP, there emerged 2 groups, the Bolshevik group and the Menshevik group. The chief differences between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks after the Second Congress centered around questions of organization. The Mensheviks drew closer to the economists and took their place within the party. For the time being, the opportunism of the Mensheviks revealed itself in questions of organization. The Mensheviks were opposed to a militant revolutionary party of the type advocated by Lenin. They wanted a loose, unorganized, Kavostist party. They worked to split the ranks of the party. With Plekhanov's help, they seized Iskra and the Central Committee, and used these central organs for their own purposes, to split the party. Seeing that the Mensheviks were threatening a split, the Bolsheviks adopted measures to curb the splitters. They mustered the local organizations to back the convocation of a Third Congress, and they started their own newspaper, Thus, on the eve of the First Russian Revolution, when the Russo-Japanese War had already begun, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks acted as 2 separate political groups. CHAPTERTHREE. The Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks in the period of the Russo-Japanese War and the First Russian Revolution, 1904–1907. 1. Russo-Japanese War. Further rise of the revolutionary movement in Russia. Strikes in St. Petersburg. Workers' demonstration before the Winter Palace on January 9, 1905. Demonstration fired upon. Outbreak of the revolution. At the end of the 19th century, the imperialist states began an intense struggle for mastery of the Pacific and for the partition of China. Tsarist Russia, too, took part in this struggle. In 1900, Tsarist troops together with Japanese, German, British and French troops suppressed with unparalleled cruelty an uprising of the Chinese people directed against the foreign imperialists. Even before this, the Tsarist government had compelled China to surrender to Russia the Liaodong Peninsula with the fortress of Port Arthur. Russia secured the right to build railways on Chinese territory. A railway was built in northern Manchuria, the Chinese Eastern Railway, and Russian troops were stationed there to protect it. Northern Manchuria fell under the military occupation of Tsarist Russia. Tsardom was advancing towards Korea. The Russian bourgeoisie was making plans for founding a Yellow Russia in Manchuria. Its annexations in the Far East brought Tsardom into conflict with another marauder, Japan, which had rapidly become an imperialist country and was also bent on annexing territories on the Asiatic continent, in the first place at the expense of China. Like Tsarist Russia, Japan was striving to lay her hands on Korea and Manchuria. Already at that time, Japan dreamed of seizing Sakhalin in the Russian Far East. Great Britain, who feared the growing strength of Tsarist Russia in the Far East, secretly sided with Japan. War between Russia and Japan was brewing. The Tsarist government was pushed to this war by the big bourgeoisie, which was seeking new markets, and by the more reactionary sections of the landlord class. 54. Without waiting for the Tsarist government to declare war, Japan started hostilities herself. She had a good espionage service in Russia and anticipated that her foe would be unprepared for the struggle. In January 1904, without declaring war, Japan suddenly attacked the Russian fortress of Port Arthur and inflicted heavy losses on the Russian fleet lying in the harbor. That is how the Russo-Japanese War began. The Tsarist government reckoned that the war would help to strengthen its political position and to check the revolution. But it miscalculated. The Tsarist regime was shaken more than ever by the war. Poorly armed and trained, and commanded by incompetent and corrupt generals, the Russian army suffered defeat after defeat. Capitalists, government officials and generals grew rich on the war. Peculation was rampant. The troops were poorly supplied. When the army was short of ammunition, it would receive, as if in derision, carloads of icons. The soldiers said bitterly, "The Japanese are giving it to us with shells, we're to give it to them with icons." Special trains, instead of being used to evacuate the wounded, were loaded with property looted by the Tsarist generals. The Japanese besieged and subsequently captured Port Arthur. After inflicting a number of defeats on the Tsarist army, they finally routed it near Mukden. In this battle the Tsarist army of 300,000 men lost about 120,000 men, killed, wounded or taken prisoner. This was followed by the utter defeat and destruction in the Straits of Tsushima of the Tsarist fleet dispatched from the Baltic to relieve Port Arthur. The defeat at Tsushima was disastrous. Of the 20 warships dispatched by the Tsar, 13 were sunk or destroyed and 4 captured. Tsarist Russia had definitely lost the war. The Tsarist government was compelled to conclude an ignominious peace with Japan. Japan seized Korea and deprived Russia of Port Arthur and of half the island of Sakhalin. The people had not wanted the war and realized how harmful it would be for the country. They paid heavily for the backwardness of Tsarist Russia. The Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks adopted different attitudes towards the war. The Mensheviks, including Trotsky, were sinking to a position of defending the fatherland of the Tsar, the landlords and the capitalists. The Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, on the other hand, held that the defeat of the Tsarist government in this predatory war would be useful, as it would weaken TSRdom and strengthen the revolution. The defeats of the Tsarist armies opened the eyes of the masses to the rottenness of TSRdom. Their hatred for the Tsarist regime grew daily more intense. The fall of Port Arthur meant the beginning of the fall of the autocracy, Lenin wrote. The Tsar wanted to use the war to stifle the revolution. He achieved the very opposite. The Russo-Japanese War hastened the outbreak of the revolution. In Tsarist Russia the capitalist yoke was aggravated by the yoke of TSRdom. The workers not only suffered from capitalist exploitation, from inhuman toil, but, in common with the whole people, suffered from a lack of all rights. The politically advanced workers therefore strove to lead the revolutionary movement of all the democratic elements in town and country against TSRdom. The peasants were in dire need owing to lack of land and the numerous survivals of serfdom, and lived in a state of bondage to the landlords and kulaks. The nations inhabiting Tsarist Russia groaned beneath the double yoke, that of their own landlords and capitalists and that of the Russian landlords and capitalists. The economic crisis of 1900-03 had aggravated the hardships of the toiling masses. The war intensified them still further. The war defeats added fuel to the hatred of the masses for TSRdom. The patience of the people was coming to an end. As we see, there were grounds enough and to spare for revolution. In December 1904 a huge and well-organized strike of workers took place in Baku, led by the Baku Committee of the Bolsheviks. The strike ended in a victory for the workers and a collective agreement was concluded between the oilfield workers and owners, the first of its kind in the history of the working class movement in Russia. The Baku strike marked the beginning of a revolutionary rise in Transcaucasia and in various parts of Russia. The Baku strike was the signal for the glorious actions in January and February all over Russia. Stalin. This strike was like a clap of thunder heralding a great revolutionary storm. The revolutionary storm broke with the events of January 9, 22. New Style, 1905, in St. Petersburg. On January 3, 1905, a strike began at the biggest of the St. Petersburg plants, the Putilov, now the Kirov, works. The strike was caused by the dismissal of 4 workers. It grew rapidly and was joined by other St. Petersburg mills and factories. The strike became general. The movement grew formidable. The Tsarist government decided to crush it while it was still in its earliest phase. In 1904, prior to the Putilov strike, the police had used the services of an agent provocateur, a priest by the name of Gapon, to form an organization of the workers known as the Assembly of Russian Factory Workers. This organization had its branches in all the districts of St. Petersburg. When the strike broke out, the priest Gapon at the meetings of his society put forward a treacherous plan. All the workers were to gather on January 9 and, carrying church banners and portraits of the Tsar, to march in peaceful procession to the Winter Palace and present a petition to the Tsar stating their needs. The Tsar would appear before the people, listen to them and satisfy their demands. Gapon undertook to assist the Tsarist Okhrana by providing a pretext for firing on the workers and drowning the working class movement in blood. But this police plot recoiled on the head of the Tsarist government. The petition was discussed at workers' meetings where amendments were made. Bolsheviks spoke at these meetings without openly announcing themselves as such. Under their influence, the petition was supplemented by demands for freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of association for the workers, the convocation of a constituent assembly for the purpose of changing the political system of Russia, equality of all before the law, separation of church from the state, termination of the war, an 8-hour working day, and the handing over of the land to the peasants. At these meetings the Bolsheviks explained to the workers that liberty could not be obtained by petitions to the Tsar, but would have to be won by force of arms. The Bolsheviks warned the workers that they would be fired upon. But they were unable to prevent the procession to the Winter Palace. A large part of the workers still believed that the Tsar would help them. The movement had taken a strong hold on the masses. The petition of the St. Petersburg workers stated, "We, the working men of St. Petersburg, our wives, our children and our helpless old parents, have come to thee, our sovereign, to seek truth and protection. We are poverty-stricken, we are oppressed, we are burdened with unendurable toil. We suffer humiliation and are not treated like human beings. We have suffered in patience, but we are being driven deeper and deeper into the slough of poverty, lack of rights and ignorance. We are being strangled by despotism and tyranny. Our patience is exhausted. The dreaded moment has arrived when we would rather die than bear these intolerable sufferings any longer." Early in the morning of January 9, 1905, the workers marched to the Winter Palace where the Tsar was then residing. They came with their whole families, wives, children and old folk, carrying portraits of the Tsar and church banners. They chanted hymns as they marched. They were unarmed. Over 140,000 persons gathered in the streets. They met with a hostile reception from Nicholas II. He gave orders to fire upon the unarmed workers. That day over 1,000 workers were killed and more than 2,000 wounded by the Tsar's troops. The streets of St. Petersburg ran with workers' blood. The Bolsheviks had marched with the workers. Many of them were killed or arrested. There, in the streets running with workers' blood, the Bolsheviks explained to the workers who it was that bore the guilt for this heinous crime and how he was to be fought. January 9th came to be known as Bloody Sunday. On that day the workers received a bloody lesson. It was their faith in the Tsar that was riddled by bullets on that day. They came to realize that they could win their rights only by struggle. That evening barricades were already being erected in the working-class districts. The workers said, "The Tsar gave it to us. We'll now give it to him." The fearful news of the Tsar's bloody crime spread far and wide. The whole working class, the whole country was stirred by indignation and abhorrence. There was not a town where the workers did not strike in protest against the Tsar's villainous act and did not put forward political demands. The workers now emerged into the streets with the slogan, "Down with autocracy." In January the number of strikers reached the immense figure of 440,000. More workers came out on strike in 1 month than during the whole preceding decade. The working class movement rose to an unprecedented height. Revolution in Russia had begun. 2. Workers' political strikes and demonstrations, growth of the revolutionary movement among the peasants. Revolt on the battleship, Potemkin. After January 9 the revolutionary struggle of the workers grew more acute and assumed a political character. The workers began to pass from economic strikes and sympathy strikes to political strikes, to demonstrations, and in places to armed resistance to the Tsarist troops. Particularly stubborn and well organized were the strikes in the big cities such as St. Petersburg, Moscow, Warsaw, Riga and Baku, where large numbers of workers were concentrated. The metal workers marched in the front ranks of the fighting proletariat. By their strikes, the vanguard of the workers stirred up the less class-conscious sections and roused the whole working class to the struggle. The influence of the Social Democrats grew rapidly. The May Day demonstrations in a number of towns were marked by clashes with police and troops. In Warsaw, the demonstration was fired upon and several hundred persons were killed or wounded. At the call of the Polish Social Democrats, the workers replied to the shooting in Warsaw by a general protest strike. Strikes and demonstrations did not cease throughout the month of May. In that month over 200,000 workers went on strike throughout Russia. General strikes broke out in Baku, Lodz and Ivanovo-Voznesensk. More and more frequently the strikers and demonstrators clashed with the Tsarist troops. Such clashes took place in a number of cities, Odessa, Warsaw, Riga, Lodz and others. Particularly acute was the struggle in Lodz, a large Polish industrial center. The workers erected scores of barricades in the streets of Lodz and for 3 days, June 22 to 24, 1905, battled in the streets against the Tsarist troops. Here armed action merged with a general strike. Lenin regarded these battles as the first armed action of the workers in Russia. The outstanding strike that summer was that of the workers of Ivanovo-Voznesensk. It lasted for about 2.5 months, from the end of May to the beginning of August 1905. About 70,000 workers, among them many women, took part in the strike. It was led by the Bolshevik Northern Committee. Thousands of workers gathered almost daily outside the city on the banks of the river Taka. At these meetings they discussed their needs. The workers' meetings were addressed by Bolsheviks. In order to crush the strike, the Tsarist authorities ordered the troops to disperse the workers and to fire upon them. Several scores of workers were killed and several hundred wounded. A state of emergency was proclaimed in the city. But the workers remained firm and would not return to work. They and their families starved, but would not surrender. It was only extreme exhaustion that in the end compelled them to return to work. The strike steeled the workers. It was an example of the courage, staunchness, endurance and solidarity of the working class. It was a real political education for the workers of Ivanovo-Voznesensk. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution. During the strike, the workers of Ivanovo-Voznesensk set up a Council of Representatives, which was actually one of the first Soviets of workers' deputies in Russia. The workers' political strikes stirred up the whole country. Following the town, the countryside began to rise. In the spring, peasant unrest broke out. The peasants marched in great crowds against the landlords, raided their estates, sugar refineries and distilleries, and set fire to their palaces and manors. In a number of places the peasants seized the land, resorted to wholesale cutting down of forests, and demanded that the landed estates be turned over to the people. They seized the landlords' stores of grain and other products and divided them among the starving. The landlords fled in panic to the towns. The Tsarist government dispatched soldiers and Cossacks to crush the peasants' revolts. The troops fired on the peasants, arrested the ringleaders, and flogged and tortured them. But the peasants would not cease their struggle. The peasant movement spread ever wider in the central parts of Russia, the Volga region, and in Transcaucasia, especially in Georgia. The Social Democrats penetrated deeper into the countryside. The Central Committee of the party issued an appeal to the peasants entitled, "To you, peasants, we address our word." The Social Democratic committees in the Tver, Saratov, Poltava, Chernigov, Ekaterinoslav, Tiflis and many other provinces issued appeals to the peasants. In the villages, the Social Democrats would arrange meetings, organize circles among the peasants, and set up peasant committees. In the summer of 1905, strikes of agricultural laborers, organized by Social Democrats, occurred in many places. But this was only the beginning of the peasant struggle. The peasant movement affected only 85 UYEZDS districts, or roughly 1/7 of the total number of UYEZDS in the European part of Tsarist Russia. The movement of the workers and peasants and the series of reverses suffered by the Russian troops in the Russo-Japanese War had its influence on the armed forces. This bulwark of Ts Artem began to totter. In June 1905 a revolt broke out on the Potemkin, a battleship of the Black Sea Fleet. The battleship was at that time stationed near Odessa, where a general strike of the workers was in progress. The insurgent sailors wreaked vengeance on their more detested officers and brought the vessel to Odessa. The battleship Potemkin had gone over to the side of the revolution. Lenin attributed immense importance to this revolt. He considered it necessary for the Bolsheviks to assume the leadership of this movement and to link it up with the movement of the workers, peasants and the local garrisons. The Tsar dispatched several warships against the Potemkin, but the sailors of these vessels refused to fire on their insurgent comrades. For several days the red ensign of revolution waved from the mast of the battleship Potemkin. But at that time, in 1905, the Bolshevik Party was not the only party leading the movement, as was the case later, in 1917. There were quite a number of Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries and anarchists on board the Potemkin. Consequently, although individual Social Democrats took part in the revolt, it lacked proper and sufficiently experienced leadership. At decisive moments part of the sailors wavered. The other vessels of the Black Sea Fleet did not join the revolt of the Potemkin. Having run short of coal and provisions, the revolutionary battleship was compelled to make for the Romanian shore and their surrender to the authorities. The revolt of the sailors on the battleship Potemkin ended in defeat. The sailors who subsequently fell into the hands of the Tsarist government were committed for trial. Some were executed and others condemned to exile and penal servitude. But the revolt in itself was an event of the utmost importance. The Potemkin revolt was the first instance of mass revolutionary action in the army and navy, the first occasion on which a large unit of the armed forces of the Tsar sided with the revolution. This revolt made the idea of the army and navy joining forces with the working class, the people, more comprehensible to and nearer to the heart of the workers and peasants, and especially of the soldiers and sailors themselves. The workers' recourse to mass political strikes and demonstrations, the growth of the peasant movement, the armed clashes between the people and the police and troops, and, finally, the revolt in the Black Sea Fleet, all went to show that conditions were ripening for an armed uprising of the people. This stirred the liberal bourgeoisie into action. Fearing the revolution, and at the same time frightening the Tsar with the specter of revolution, it sought to come to terms with the Tsar against the revolution. It demanded slight reforms, for the people, so as to pacify the people, to split the forces of the revolution and thus avert the horrors of revolution. Better part with some of our land than part with our heads, said the liberal landlords. The liberal bourgeoisie was preparing to share power with the Tsar. The proletariat is fighting. The bourgeoisie is stealing towards power, Lenin wrote in those days. In reference to the tactics of the working class and the tactics of the liberal bourgeoisie. The Tsarist government continued to suppress the workers and peasants with brutal ferocity. But it could not help seeing that it would never cope with the revolution by repressive measures alone. Therefore, without abandoning measures of repression, it resorted to a policy of maneuvering. On the one hand, with the help of its agents provocateurs, it incited the peoples of Russia against each other, engineering Jewish pogroms and mutual massacres of Armenians and Tatars. On the other hand, it promised to convene a representative institution, in the shape of a Zemsky Sobor or State Duma, and instructed the minister Bulygin to draw up a project for such a Duma, stipulating, however, that it was to have no legislative powers. All these measures were adopted in order to split the forces of revolution and to sever from it the moderate sections of the people. The Bolsheviks declared a boycott of the Bulygin Duma with the aim of frustrating this travesty of popular representation. The Mensheviks, on the other hand, decided not to sabotage the Duma and considered it necessary to take part in it. 3. Tactical differences between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Third Party Congress. Lenin's two tactics of social democracy in the democratic revolution. Tactical foundations of the Marxist Party. The revolution had set in motion all classes of society. The turn in the political life of the country caused by the revolution dislodged them from their old wanted positions and compelled them to regroup themselves in conformity with the new situation. Each class and each party endeavored to work out its tactics, its line of conduct, its attitude towards other classes, and its attitude towards the government. Even the Tsarist government found itself compelled to devise new and unaccustomed tactics, as instanced by the promise to convene a representative institution, the Bulygin Duma. The Social Democratic Party, too, had to work out its tactics. This was dictated by the growing tide of the revolution. It was dictated by the practical questions that faced the proletariat and brooked no delay. Organization of armed uprising, overthrow of the Tsarist government, creation of a provisional revolutionary government, participation of the Social Democrats in this government, attitude towards the peasantry and towards the liberal bourgeoisie, etc. The Social Democrats had to work out for themselves carefully considered and uniform Marxist tactics. But owing to the opportunism of the Mensheviks and their splitting activities, the Russian Social Democratic Party was at that time divided into two groups. The split could not yet be considered complete, and formally the two groups were not yet two separate parties, but in reality they very much resembled two separate parties, each with its own leading center and its own press. What helped to widen the split was the fact that to their old differences with the majority of the party over organizational questions, the Mensheviks added new differences over tactical questions. The absence of a united party resulted in the absence of uniform party tactics. A way out of the situation may have been found by immediately summoning another Congress, the Third Congress of the party, establishing common tactics and binding the minority to carry out in good faith the decisions of the Congress, the decisions of the majority. This was what the Bolsheviks proposed to the Mensheviks. But the Mensheviks would not hear of summoning the Third Congress, considering it a crime to leave the party any longer without tactics endorsed by the party and binding upon all party members. The Bolsheviks decided to take the initiative of convening the Third Congress into their own hands. All the party organizations, both Bolshevik and Menshevik, were invited to the Congress. But the Mensheviks refused to take part in the Third Congress and decided to hold one of their own. As the number of delegates at their Congress proved to be small, they called it a conference, but actually it was a Congress, a Menshevik Party Congress, whose decisions were considered binding on all Mensheviks. The Third Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Party met in London in April 1905. It was attended by 24 delegates representing 20 Bolshevik committees. All the large organizations of the party were represented. The Congress condemned the Mensheviks as a section that had split away from the party, and passed on to the business on hand, the working out of the tactics of the party. At the same time that this Congress was held, the Mensheviks held their conference in Geneva. Two Congresses, two parties, was the way Lenin summed up the situation. Both the Congress and the conference virtually discussed the same tactical questions, but the decisions they arrived at were diametrically opposite. The two sets of resolutions adopted by the Congress and the conference respectively revealed the whole depth of the tactical difference between the Third Party Congress and the Menshevik Conference, between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Here are the main points of these differences. Tactical line of the Third Party Congress. The Congress held that despite the bourgeois democratic character of the revolution in progress, despite the fact that it could not at the given moment go beyond the limits of what was possible within the framework of capitalism, it was primarily the proletariat that was interested in its complete victory, for the victory of this revolution would enable the proletariat to organize itself, to grow politically, to acquire experience and competence in political leadership of the toiling masses, and to proceed from the bourgeois revolution to the socialist revolution. Tactics of the proletariat designed to achieve the complete victory of the bourgeois democratic revolution could find support only in the peasantry, for the latter could not settle scores with the landlords and obtain possession of their lands without the complete victory of the revolution. The peasantry was therefore the natural ally of the proletariat. The liberal bourgeoisie was not interested in the complete victory of this revolution, for it needed the Tsarist regime as a whip against the workers and peasants, whom it feared more than anything else, and it would strive to preserve the Tsarist regime, only somewhat restricting its powers. The liberal bourgeoisie would therefore attempt to end matters by coming to terms with the Tsar on the basis of a constitutional monarchy. The revolution would win only if headed by the proletariat, if the proletariat, as the leader of the revolution, secured an alliance with the peasantry. If the liberal bourgeoisie were isolated, if the Social Democratic Party took an active part in the organization of the uprising of the people against TSRdom, if, as the result of a successful uprising, a provisional revolutionary government were set up that would be capable of destroying the counter-revolution root and branch and convening a constituent assembly representing the whole people, and if the Social Democratic Party did not refuse, the circumstances being favorable, to take part in the provisional revolutionary government in order to carry the revolution to its conclusion. Tactical line of the Menshevik Conference. Inasmuch as the revolution was a bourgeois revolution, only the liberal bourgeoisie could be its leader. Entry, but with the liberal bourgeoisie. The chief thing was not to frighten off the liberal bourgeoisie by a display of revolutionary spirit and not to give it a pretext to recoil from the revolution, for if it were to recoil from the revolution would be weakened. It was possible that the uprising would prove victorious, but after the triumph of the uprising the Social Democratic Party should step aside so as not to frighten away the liberal bourgeoisie. It was possible that as a result of the uprising a provisional revolutionary government would be set up, but the Social Democratic Party should under no circumstances take part in it, because this government would not be socialist in character, and because, and this was the chief thing, by its participation in this government and by its revolutionary spirit, the Social Democratic Party might frighten off the liberal bourgeoisie and thus undermine the revolution. It would be better for the prospects of the revolution if some sort of representative institution were convened, of the nature of a Zemsky Sobor or a State Duma, which could be subjected to the pressure of the working class from without so as to transform it into a constituent assembly or impel it to convene a constituent assembly. The proletariat had its own specific, purely wage worker interests, and it should attend to these interests only and not try to become the leader of the bourgeois revolution, which, being a general political revolution, concerned all classes and not the proletariat alone. Such, in brief, were the two tactics of the two groups of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. In his historic book, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution, Lenin gave a classical criticism of the tactics of the Mensheviks and a brilliant substantiation of the Bolshevik tactics. This book appeared in July 1905, that is, 2 months after the Third Party Congress. One might assume from its title that Lenin dealt in it only with tactical questions relating to the period of the bourgeois democratic revolution and had only the Russian Mensheviks in mind. But as a matter of fact, when he criticized the tactics of the Mensheviks he at the same time exposed the tactics of international opportunism, and when he substantiated the Marxist tactics in the period of the bourgeois revolution and drew the distinction between the bourgeois revolution and the socialist revolution, he at the same time formulated the fundamental principles of the Marxist tactics in the period of transition from the bourgeois revolution to the socialist revolution. Fled, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution were as follows. 1. The main tactical principle, one that runs through Lenin's whole book, is that the proletariat can and must be the leader of the bourgeois democratic revolution, the guiding force of the bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia. Lenin admitted the bourgeois character of this revolution, for, as he said, it is incapable of directly overstepping the bounds of a mere democratic revolution. However, he held that it was not a revolution of the upper strata, but a people's revolution, one that would set in motion the whole people, the whole working class, the whole peasantry. Hence the attempts of the Mensheviks to belittle the significance of the bourgeois revolution for the proletariat, to depreciate the role of the proletariat in it, and to keep the proletariat away from it were in Lenin's opinion a betrayal of the interests of the proletariat. Marxism, Lenin said, teaches the proletarian not to keep aloof from the bourgeois revolution, not to be indifferent to it, not to allow the leadership of the revolution to be assumed by the bourgeoisie, but, on the contrary, to take a most energetic part in it, to fight most resolutely for consistent proletarian democracy, for carrying the revolution to its conclusion. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 3, page 77. We must not forget, Lenin says further, that there is not, nor can there be, at the present time, any other means of bringing socialism nearer, than complete political liberty, than a democratic republic. Ibid. Page 122. Lenin foresaw two possible outcomes of the revolution. A. Either it would end in a decisive victory over T.S. Artem, in the overthrow of T.S. Artem and the establishment of a democratic republic. B. Or, if the forces were inadequate, it might end in a deal between the Tsar and the bourgeoisie at the expense of the people, in some sort of curtailed constitution, or, most likely, in some caricature of a constitution. The proletariat was interested in the better outcome of the two, that is, in a decisive victory over T.S. Artem. But such an outcome was possible only if the proletariat succeeded in becoming the leader and guide of the revolution. The outcome of the revolution, Lenin said, depends on whether the working class will play the part of a subsidiary to the bourgeoisie, a subsidiary that is powerful in the force of its onslaught against the autocracy but impotent politically, or whether it will play the part of leader of the people's revolution. Ibid. Page 41. Lenin maintained that the proletariat had every possibility of escaping the fate of a subsidiary to the bourgeoisie, and of becoming the leader of the bourgeois democratic revolution. This possibility, according to Lenin, arises from the following. First, the proletariat, being, by virtue of its very position, the most advanced and the only consistently revolutionary class, is for that very reason called upon to play the leading part in the general democratic revolutionary movement in Russia. Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. Ed. Volume 8, page 75. Secondly, the proletariat has its own political party, which is independent of the bourgeoisie and which enables the proletariat to weld itself into a united and independent political force. Ibid. Page 75. Thirdly, the proletariat is more interested than the bourgeoisie in a decisive victory of the revolution, in view of which, in a certain sense the bourgeois revolution is more advantageous to the proletariat than to the bourgeoisie. Ibid. Page 57. It is to the advantage of the bourgeoisie, Lenin wrote, to rely on certain remnants of the past as against the proletariat, for instance, on the monarchy, the standing army, etc. It is to the advantage of the bourgeoisie if the bourgeois revolution does not too resolutely sweep away all the remnants of the past, but leaves some of them, i.e., if this revolution is not fully consistent, if it is not complete and if it is not determined and relentless. It is of greater advantage to the bourgeoisie if the necessary changes in the direction of bourgeois democracy take place more slowly, more gradually, more cautiously, less resolutely, by means of reforms and not by means of revolution. If these changes develop as little as possible the independent revolutionary activity, initiative and energy of the common people, i.e., the peasantry and especially the workers, for otherwise it will be easier for the workers, as the French say, to hitch the rifle from one shoulder to the other, i.e., to turn against the bourgeoisie the guns which the bourgeois revolution will place in their hands, the liberty which the revolution will bring, the democratic institutions which will spring up on the ground that is cleared of serfdom. Tion, of the painfully slow decomposition of the putrid parts of the national organism. It is the proletariat and the peasantry that suffer first of all and most of all from their putrefaction. The revolutionary way is the way of quick amputation, which is the least painful to the proletariat, the way of the direct removal of the decomposing parts, the way of fewest concessions to and least consideration for the monarchy and the disgusting, vile, rotten and contaminating institutions which go with it. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 3, pp. 756. That, Lenin continues, is why the proletariat fights in the front ranks for a republic and contemptuously rejects silly and unworthy advice to take care not to frighten away the bourgeoisie. Ibid. Page 108. In order to convert the possibility of the proletarian leadership of the revolution into a reality, in order that the proletariat might actually become the leader, the guiding force of the bourgeois revolution, at least two conditions were needed, according to Lenin. First, it was necessary for the proletariat to have an ally who was interested in a decisive victory over T.S. Artem and who might be disposed to accept the leadership of the proletariat. This was dictated by the very idea of leadership, for a leader ceases to be a leader if there is nobody to lead. A guide ceases to be a guide if there is nobody to guide. Lenin considered that the peasantry was such an ally. Secondly, it was necessary that the class, which was fighting the proletariat for the leadership of the revolution and striving to become its sole leader, should be forced out of the arena of leadership and isolated. This too was dictated by the very idea of leadership, which precluded the possibility of there being two leaders of the revolution. Lenin considered that the liberal bourgeoisie was such a class. Only the proletariat can be a consistent fighter for democracy. Lenin said, it may become a victorious fighter for democracy only if the peasant masses join its revolutionary struggle. Ibid. Page 86. And further, the peasantry includes a great number of semi-proletarian as well as petty bourgeois elements. This causes it also to be unstable and compels the proletariat to unite in a strictly class party. But the instability of the peasantry differs radically from the instability of the bourgeoisie, for at the present time the peasantry is interested not so much in the absolute preservation of private property as in the confiscation of the landed estates, one of the principal forms of private property. While this does not cause the peasantry to become socialist or cease to be petty bourgeois, the peasantry is capable of becoming a wholehearted and most radical adherent of the democratic revolution. The peasantry will inevitably become such if only the progress of revolutionary events, which is enlightening it, is not interrupted too soon by the treachery of the bourgeoisie and the defeat of the proletariat. Subject to this condition, the peasantry will inevitably become a bulwark of the revolution and the republic, for only a completely victorious revolution can give the peasantry everything in the sphere of agrarian reforms, everything that the peasants desire, of which they dream, and of which they truly stand in need. Ibid. pp. 108-09. Analyzing the objections of the Mensheviks, who asserted that these Bolshevik tactics will compel the bourgeois classes to recoil from the cause of the revolution and thus curtail its scope, and characterizing these objections as tactics of betrayal of the revolution, as tactics which would convert the proletariat into a wretched appendage of the bourgeois classes, Lenin wrote. Those who really understand the role of the peasantry in the victorious Russian Revolution would not dream of saying that the sweep of the revolution would be diminished if the bourgeoisie recoiled from it. For, as a matter of fact, the Russian Revolution will begin to assume its real sweep, will really assume the widest revolutionary sweep possible in the epoch of bourgeois democratic revolution, only when the bourgeoisie recoils from it and when the masses of the peasantry come out as active revolutionaries side by side with the proletariat. In order that it may be consistently carried to its conclusion, our democratic revolution must rely on such forces as are capable of paralyzing the inevitable inconsistency of the bourgeoisie, i.e., capable precisely of causing it to recoil from the revolution. Ibid. Page 110. Such is the main tactical principle regarding the proletariat as the leader of the bourgeois revolution, the fundamental tactical principle regarding the hegemony, leading role, of the proletariat in the bourgeois revolution, expounded by Lenin in his book, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution. This was a new line of the Marxist Party on questions of tactics in the bourgeois democratic revolution, a line fundamentally different from the tactical lines hitherto existing in the arsenal of Marxism. The situation before had been that in the bourgeois revolution, in Western Europe, for instance, it was the bourgeoisie that played the leading part. The proletariat willy-nilly playing the part of its subsidiary, while the peasantry was a reserve of the bourgeoisie. The Marxists considered such a combination more or less inevitable, at the same time stipulating that the proletariat must as far as possible fight for its own immediate class demands and have its own political party. Now, under the new historical conditions, according to Lenin, the situation was changing in such a way that the proletariat was becoming the guiding force of the bourgeois revolution, the bourgeoisie was being edged out of the leadership of the revolution, while the peasantry was becoming a reserve of the proletariat. The claim that Plekhanov also stood for the hegemony of the proletariat is based upon a misunderstanding. Plekhanov flirted with the idea of the hegemony of the proletariat and was not averse to recognizing it in words. That is true. But in reality he was opposed to this idea in its essence. The hegemony of the proletariat implies the leading role of the proletariat in the bourgeois revolution, accompanied by a policy of alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry and a policy of isolation of the liberal bourgeoisie. Whereas Plekhanov, as we know, was opposed to the policy of isolating the liberal bourgeoisie, favored a policy of agreement with the liberal bourgeoisie, and was opposed to a policy of alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. As a matter of fact, Plekhanov's tactical line was the Menshevik line, which rejected the hegemony of the proletariat. 2. Lenin considered that the most effective means of overthrowing TSRDM and achieving a democratic republic was a victorious armed uprising of the people. Contrary to the Mensheviks, Lenin held that the general democratic revolutionary movement has already brought about the necessity for an armed uprising, that the organization of the proletariat for uprising had already been placed on the order of the day as one of the essential, principal and indispensable tasks of the party, and that it was necessary to adopt the most energetic measures to arm the proletariat and to ensure the possibility of directly leading the uprising. Lenin, Collected Works, Russ. ed. Volume 8, page 75. To guide the masses to an uprising and to turn it into an uprising of the whole people, Lenin deemed it necessary to issue such slogans, such appeals to the masses as would set free their revolutionary initiative, organize them for insurrection and disorganize the machinery of power of TSRDM. He considered that these slogans were furnished by the tactical decisions of the Third Party Congress, to the defense of which his book, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution, was devoted. The following, he considered, were these slogans. A. Mass political strikes, which may be of great importance at the beginning and in the very process of the insurrection. Ibid. Page 75. B. Immediate realization, in a revolutionary way, of the 8-hour working day and of the other immediate demands of the working class. Ibid. Page 47. C. Immediate organization of revolutionary peasant committees in order to carry out, in a revolutionary way, all the democratic changes, including the confiscation of the landed estates. Ibid. Page 88. D. Arming of the workers. Here 2 points are of particular interest. First, the tactics of realizing in a revolutionary way the 8-hour day in the towns, and the democratic changes in the countryside, that is, a way which disregards the authorities, disregards the law, which ignores both the authorities and the law, breaks the existing laws and establishes a new order by unauthorized action, as an accomplished fact. This was a new tactical method, the use of which paralyzed the machinery of power of TSRDM and set free the activity and creative initiative of the masses. These tactics gave rise to the revolutionary strike committees in the towns and the revolutionary peasant committees in the countryside, the former of which later developed into the Soviets of Workers' Deputies and the latter into the Soviets of Peasants' Deputies. Secondly, the use of mass political strikes, the use of general political strikes, which later, in the course of the revolution, were of prime importance in the revolutionary mobilization of the masses. This was a new and very important weapon in the hands of the proletariat, a weapon hitherto unknown in the practice of the Marxist parties and one that subsequently gained recognition. Lenin held that following the victorious uprising of the people the Tsarist government should be replaced by a provisional revolutionary government. It would be the task of the provisional revolutionary government to consolidate the conquests of the revolution, to crush the resistance of the counter-revolution and to give effect to the minimum program of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Lenin maintained that unless these tasks were accomplished a decisive victory over TSRDM would be impossible. And in order to accomplish these tasks and achieve a decisive victory over TSRDM, the provisional revolutionary government would have to be not an ordinary kind of government, but a government of the dictatorship of the victorious classes, of the workers and peasants. It would have to be a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Citing Marx's well-known thesis that, after from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution a revolution, every provisional organization of the state requires a dictatorship, and an energetic dictatorship at that, Lenin came to the conclusion that if the provisional revolutionary government was to ensure a decisive victory over TSRDM, it could be nothing else but a dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. A decisive victory of the revolution over TSRDM is the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. Lenin said, and such a victory will be precisely a dictatorship, i.e., it must inevitably rely on military force, on the arming of the masses, on an uprising and not on institutions of one kind or another, established in a lawful or peaceful way. It can be only a dictatorship, for the realization of the changes which are urgently and absolutely indispensable for the proletariat and the peasantry will call forth the desperate resistance of the landlords, of the big bourgeoisie, and of TSRDM. Without a dictatorship it is impossible to break down that resistance and to repel the counter-revolutionary attempts. But of course it will be a democratic, not a socialist dictatorship. It will not be able, without a series of intermediary stage of revolutionary development, to affect the foundations of capitalism. At best it may bring about a radical redistribution of landed property in favor of the peasantry, establish consistent and full democracy, including the formation of a republic, eradicate all the oppressive features of Asiatic bondage, not only in village but also in factory life, lay the foundation for a thorough improvement in the position of the workers and for a rise in their standard of living, and, last but not least, carry the revolutionary conflagration into Europe. Such a victory will by no means as yet transform our bourgeois revolution into a socialist revolution. The democratic revolution will not directly overstep the bounds of bourgeois social and economic relationships. Nevertheless, the significance of such a victory for the future development of Russia and of the whole world will be immense. Nothing will raise the revolutionary energy of the world proletariat so much, nothing will shorten the path leading to its complete victory to such an extent, as this decisive victory of the revolution that has now started in Russia. Lenin, Selected Works. Volume 3, page 82-3. As to the attitude of the Social Democrats towards the provisional revolutionary government and as to whether it would be permissible for them to take part in it, Lenin fully upheld the resolution of the Third Party Congress on the subject, which reads, subject to the relation of forces, and other factors which cannot be exactly determined beforehand, representatives of our party may participate in the provisional revolutionary government for the purpose of relentless struggle against all counter-revolutionary attempts and of the defense of the independent interests of the working class. An indispensable condition for such participation is that the party should exercise strict control over its representatives and that the independence of the Social Democratic Party, which is striving for a complete socialist revolution and, consequently, is irreconcilably hostile to all the bourgeois parties, should be strictly maintained. Whether the participation of Social Democrats in the provisional revolutionary government prove possible or not, we must propagate among the broadest masses of the proletariat the necessity for permanent pressure to be brought to bear upon the provisional government by the armed proletariat, led by the Social Democratic Party, for the purpose of defending, consolidating and extending the gains of the revolution. Ibid. pp. 46-7. As to the Mensheviks' objection that the provisional government would still be a bourgeois government, that the Social Democrats could not be permitted to take part in such a government unless one wanted to commit the same mistake as the French socialist Millerand when he joined the French bourgeois government, Lenin parried this objection by pointing out that the Mensheviks were here mixing up two different things and were betraying their inability to treat the question as Marxists should. In France it was a question of socialists taking part in a reactionary bourgeois government at a time when there was no revolutionary situation in the country, which made it incumbent upon the socialists not to join such a government. In Russia, on the other hand, it was a question of socialists taking part in a revolutionary bourgeois government fighting for the victory of the revolution at a time when the revolution was in full swing, a circumstance which would make it permissible for, and, under favorable circumstances, incumbent upon the Social Democrats to take part in such a government in order to strike at the counter-revolution not only from below, from without, but also, from above, from within the government. 3. While advocating the victory of the bourgeois revolution and the achievement of a democratic republic, Lenin had not the least intention of coming to a halt in the democratic stage and confining the scope of the revolutionary movement to the accomplishment of bourgeois democratic tasks. On the contrary, Lenin maintained that following upon the accomplishment of the democratic tasks, the proletariat and the other exploited masses would have to begin a struggle, this time for the socialist revolution. Lenin knew this and regarded it as the duty of social democrats to do everything to make the bourgeois democratic revolution pass into the socialist revolution. Lenin held that the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry was necessary not in order to end the revolution at the point of consummation of its victory over TSRdom, but in order to prolong the state of revolution as much as possible, to destroy the last remnants of counter-revolution, to make the flame of revolution spread to Europe, and, having in the meantime given the proletariat the opportunity of educating itself politically and organizing itself into a great army, to begin the direct transition to the socialist revolution. Dealing with the scope of the bourgeois revolution, and with the character the Marxist Party should lend it, Lenin wrote, "The proletariat must carry to completion the democratic revolution, by allying to itself the mass of the peasantry in order to crush by force the resistance of the autocracy and to paralyze the instability of the bourgeoisie. The proletariat must accomplish the socialist revolution by allying to itself the mass of the semi-proletarian elements of the population in order to crush by force the resistance of the bourgeoisie and to paralyze the instability of the peasantry and the petty bourgeoisie. Such are the tasks of the proletariat, which the new Iskra ISDS, that is, Mensheviks, ed. always present so narrowly in their arguments and resolutions about the scope of the revolution. Ibid. pp. 110-11. And further, at the head of the whole of the people, and particularly of the peasantry, for complete freedom, for a consistent democratic revolution, for a republic. At the head of all the toilers and the exploited, for socialism. Such must in practice be the policy of the revolutionary proletariat, such is the class slogan which must permeate and determine the solution of every tactical problem, of every practical step of the Workers' Party during the revolution. Ibid. Page 124. In order to leave nothing unclear, 2 months after the appearance of the two tactics, Lenin wrote an article entitled, Attitude of Social Democrats to the Peasant Movement, in which he explained, "From the democratic revolution we shall at once, and just in accordance with the measure of our strength, the strength of the class-conscious and organized proletariat, begin to pass to the socialist revolution. We stand for uninterrupted revolution. We shall not stop halfway." Ibid. Page 145. This was a new line in the question of the relation between the bourgeois revolution and the socialist revolution, a new theory of a regrouping of forces around the proletariat, towards the end of the bourgeois revolution, for a direct transition to the socialist revolution, the theory of the bourgeois democratic revolution passing into the socialist revolution. In working out this new line, Lenin based himself, first, on the well-known thesis of uninterrupted revolution advanced by Marx at the end of the 40s of the last century in the address to the Communist League, and, secondly, on the well-known idea of the necessity of combining the peasant revolutionary movement with the proletarian revolution which Marx expressed in a letter to Engels in 1856, saying that the whole thing in Germany will depend on the possibility of backing the proletarian revolution by some second edition of the Peasants' War. However, these brilliant ideas of Marx were not developed subsequently in the works of Marx and Engels, while the theoreticians of the Second International did their utmost to bury them and consign them to oblivion. To Lenin fell the task of bringing these forgotten ideas of Marx to light and restoring them to their full rights. But in restoring these Marxian ideas, Lenin did not, and could not, confine himself to merely repeating them, but developed them further and molded them into a harmonious theory of socialist revolution by introducing a new factor, an indispensable factor of the socialist revolution, namely, an alliance of the proletariat with the semi-proletarian elements of town and country as a condition for the victory of the proletarian revolution. This line confuted the tactical position of the West European social democratic parties, who took it for granted that after the bourgeois revolution the peasant masses, including the poor peasants, would necessarily desert the revolution, as a result of which the bourgeois revolution would be followed by a prolonged interval, a long lull, lasting 50 or 100 years, if not longer, during which the proletariat would be peacefully exploited and the bourgeoisie would lawfully enrich itself until the time came round for a new revolution, a socialist revolution. This was a new theory which held that the socialist revolution would be accomplished not by the proletariat in isolation as against the whole bourgeoisie, but by the proletariat as the leading class, which would have as allies the semi-proletarian elements of the population, the toiling and exploited millions. According to this theory, the hegemony of the proletariat in the bourgeois revolution, the proletariat being in alliance with the peasantry, would grow into the hegemony of the proletariat in the socialist revolution, the proletariat now being in alliance with the other laboring and exploited masses, while the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry would prepare the ground for the socialist dictatorship of the proletariat. It refuted the theory current among the West European social democrats who denied the revolutionary potentialities of the semi-proletarian masses of town and country and took for granted that, apart from the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, we perceive no social forces in our country in which oppositional or revolutionary combinations might find support. These were Plekhanov's words, typical of the West European social democrats. The West European social democrats held that in the socialist revolution the proletariat would stand alone, against the whole bourgeoisie, without allies, against all the non-proletarian classes and strata. They would not take account of the fact that capital exploits not only the proletarians but also the semi-proletarian millions of town and country, who are crushed by capitalism and who may become allies of the proletariat in the struggle for the emancipation of society from the capitalist yoke. The West European social democrats therefore held that conditions were not yet ripe for a socialist revolution in Europe, that the conditions could be considered ripe only when the proletariat became the majority of the nation, the majority of society, as a result of the further economic development of society. This spurious anti-proletarian standpoint of the West European social democrats was completely upset by Lenin's theory of the socialist revolution. Lenin's theory did not yet contain any direct conclusion regarding the possibility of a victory of socialism in one country, taken singly. But it did contain all, or nearly all, the fundamental elements necessary for the drawing of such a conclusion sooner or later. As we know, Lenin arrived at this conclusion 10 years later, in 1915. Such are the fundamental tactical principles expounded by Lenin in his historic book, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution. Tive of the necessity of the bourgeois revolution passing into the socialist revolution. But this does not exhaust the significance of Lenin's book. Its invaluable significance consists in that it enriched Marxism with a new theory of revolution and laid the foundation for the revolutionary tactics of the Bolshevik Party, with the help of which in 1917 the proletariat of our country achieved the victory over capitalism. 4. Further rise of the revolution. All-Russian political strike of October 1905. Retreat of TSARDOM. The Tsars. Manifesto. Rise of the Soviets of Workers' Deputies. By the autumn of 1905 the revolutionary movement had swept the whole country and gained tremendous momentum. On September 19 a printers' strike broke out in Moscow. It spread to St. Petersburg and a number of other cities. In Moscow itself the printers' strike was supported by the workers in other industries and developed into a general political strike. In the beginning of October a strike started on the Moscow-Kazan Railway. Within 2 days it was joined by all the railwaymen of the Moscow Railway Junction, and soon all the railways of the country were in the grip of the strike. The postal and telegraph services came to a standstill. In various cities of Russia the workers gathered at huge meetings and decided to down tools. The strike spread to factory after factory, mill after mill, city after city, and region after region. The workers were joined by the minor employees, students and intellectuals, lawyers, engineers and doctors. The October political strike became an all-Russian strike which embraced nearly the whole country, including the most remote districts, and nearly all the workers, including the most backward strata. About 1 million industrial workers alone took part in the general political strike, not counting the large number of railwaymen, postal and telegraph employees and others. The whole life of the country came to a standstill. The government was paralyzed. The working class headed the struggle of the masses against the autocracy. The Bolshevik slogan of a mass political strike had borne fruit. The October general strike revealed the power and might of the proletarian movement and compelled the mortally frightened Tsar to issue his manifesto of October 17, 1905. This manifesto promised the people the unshakable foundations of civil liberty, real inviolability of person, and freedom of conscience, speech, assembly and association. It promised to convene a legislative Duma and to extend the franchise to all classes of the population. Thus, Bulygin's deliberative Duma was swept away by the tide of revolution. The Bolshevik tactics of boycotting the Bulygin Duma proved to have been right. Nevertheless, the manifesto of October 17 was a fraud on the people, a trick of the Tsar to gain some sort of respite in which to lull the credulous and to win time to rally his forces and then to strike at the revolution. In words the Tsarist government promised liberty, but actually it granted nothing substantial. So far, promises were all that the workers and peasants had received from the government. Instead of the broad political amnesty which was expected, on October 21 amnesty was granted to only a small section of political prisoners. At the same time, with the object of dividing the forces of the people, the government engineered a number of sanguinary Jewish pogroms, in which many thousands of people perished, and in order to crush the revolution it created police-controlled gangster organizations known as the League of the Russian People and the League of Michael the Archangel. These organizations, in which a prominent part was played by reactionary landlords, merchants, priests, and semi-criminal elements of the vagabond type, were christened by the people Black Hundreds. The Black Hundreds, with the support of the police, openly manhandled and murdered politically advanced workers, revolutionary intellectuals and students, burned down meeting places and fired upon assemblies of citizens. These so far were the only results of the Tsar's manifesto. There was a popular song at the time which ran, "The Tsar caught fright, issued a manifesto. Liberty for the dead, for the living, arrest." The Bolsheviks explained to the masses that the manifesto of October 17th was a trap. They branded the conduct of the government after the promulgation of the manifesto as provocative. The Bolsheviks called the workers to arms, to prepare for armed uprising. The workers set about forming fighting squads with greater energy than ever. It became clear to them that the first victory of October 17th, wrested by the general political strike, demanded of them further efforts, the continuation of the struggle for the overthrow of TS Artem. Antri, having wrung the manifesto from the Tsar, were still not strong enough to overthrow TS Artem, whereas TS Artem was no longer able to rule by the old methods alone and had been compelled to give a paper promise of civil liberties and a legislative Duma. In those stormy days of the October political strike, in the fire of the struggle against TS Artem, the revolutionary creative initiative of the working-class masses forged a new and powerful weapon, the Soviets of Workers' Deputies. The Soviets of Workers' Deputies, which were assemblies of delegates from all mills and factories, represented a type of mass political organization of the working class which the world had never seen before. The Soviets that first arose in 1905 were the prototype of the Soviet power which the proletariat, led by the Bolshevik Party, set up in 1917. The Soviets were a new revolutionary form of the creative initiative of the people. They were set up exclusively by the revolutionary sections of the population, in defiance of all laws and prescripts of TS Artem. They were a manifestation of the independent action of the people who were rising to fight TS Artem. The Bolsheviks regarded the Soviets as the embryo of revolutionary power. They maintained that the strength and significance of the Soviets would depend solely on the strength and success of the uprising. The Mensheviks regarded the Soviets neither as embryonic organs of revolutionary power nor as organs of uprising. They looked upon the Soviets as organs of local self-government, in the nature of democratized municipal government bodies. In St. Petersburg, elections to the Soviet of Workers' Deputies took place in all the mills and factories on October 13, 26, New Style, 1905. The first meeting of the Soviet was held that night. Moscow followed. St. Petersburg informing a Soviet of Workers' Deputies. The St. Petersburg Soviet of Workers' Deputies, being the Soviet of the most important industrial and revolutionary center of Russia, the capital of the Tsarist Empire, ought to have played a decisive role in the revolution of 1905. However, it did not perform its task, owing to its bad, Menshevik leadership. As we know, Lenin had not yet arrived in St. Petersburg, he was still abroad. The Mensheviks took advantage of Lenin's absence to make their way into the St. Petersburg Soviet and to seize hold of its leadership. It was not surprising under such circumstances that the Mensheviks Krustalov, Trotsky, Parvus and others managed to turn the St. Petersburg Soviet against the policy of an uprising. Dears be withdrawn from St. Petersburg. The Soviet, instead of arming the workers and preparing them for an uprising, just marked time and was against preparations for an uprising. Altogether different was the role played in the revolution by the Moscow Soviet of Workers' Deputies. From the very first the Moscow Soviet pursued a thoroughly revolutionary policy. The leadership of the Moscow Soviet was in the hands of the Bolsheviks. Thanks to them, side by side with the Soviet of Workers' Deputies, there arose in Moscow a Soviet of Soldiers' Deputies. The Moscow Soviet became an organ of armed uprising. In the period, October to December 1905, Soviets of Workers' Deputies were set up in a number of large towns and in nearly all the working-class centers. Attempts were made to organize Soviets of Soldiers and Sailors' Deputies and to unite them with the Soviets of Workers' Deputies. In some localities Soviets of Workers and Peasants' Deputies were formed. The influence of the Soviets was tremendous. In spite of the fact that they often arose spontaneously, lacked definite structure and were loosely organized, they acted as a governmental power. Without legal authority, they introduced freedom of the press and an 8-hour working day. They called upon the people not to pay taxes to the Tsarist government. In some cases they confiscated government funds and used them for the needs of the revolution. 5. December Armed Uprising. Defeat of the uprising. Retreat of the revolution. First State Duma. 4th, Unity Party Congress. During October and November 1905, the revolutionary struggle of the masses went on developing with intense vigor. Workers' strikes continued. The struggle of the peasants against the landlords assumed wide dimensions in the autumn of 1905. The peasant movement embraced over one-third of the UYEZDS of the country. The provinces of Saratov, Tambov, Chernikov, Tiflis, Kutais and several others were the scenes of veritable peasant revolts. Yet the onslaught of the peasant masses was still inadequate. The peasant movement lacked organization and leadership. Unrest increased also among the soldiers in a number of cities: Tiflis, Vladivostok, Tashkent, Samarkand, Kursk, Sukhum, Warsaw, Kiev, and Riga. Revolts broke out in Kronstadt and among the sailors of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, November 1905. But the revolts were isolated, and the Tsarist government was able to suppress them. Revolts in units of the army and navy were frequently provoked by the brutal conduct of the officers, by bad food, bean riots, and similar causes. The bulk of the sailors and soldiers in revolt did not yet clearly realize the necessity for the overthrow of the Tsarist government, for the energetic prosecution of the armed struggle. They were still too peaceful and complacent. They frequently made the mistake of releasing officers who had been arrested at the outbreak of the revolt, and would allow themselves to be placated by the promises and coaxing of their superiors. The revolutionary movement had approached the verge of armed insurrection. The Bolsheviks called upon the masses to rise in arms against the Tsar and the landlords, and explained to them that this was inevitable. The Bolsheviks worked indefatigably in preparing for armed uprising. Revolutionary work was carried on among the soldiers and sailors, and military organizations of the party were set up in the armed forces. Workers' fighting squads were formed in a number of cities, and their members taught the use of arms. The purchase of arms from abroad and the smuggling of them into Russia was organized, prominent members of the party taking part in arranging for their transportation. In November 1905, Lenin returned to Russia. He took a direct part in the preparations for armed uprising, while keeping out of the way of the Tsar's gendarmes and spies. His articles in the Bolshevik newspaper, Novaya Zhizn, New Life, served to guide the party in its day-to-day work. At this period, Comrade Stalin was carrying on tremendous revolutionary work in Transcaucasia. He exposed and lashed the Mensheviks as foes of the revolution and of the armed uprising. He resolutely prepared the workers for the decisive battle against the autocracy. Speaking at a meeting of workers in Tiflis on the day the Tsar's manifesto was announced, Comrade Stalin said, "What do we need in order to really win? We need three things. First, arms; second, arms; third, arms and arms again." In December 1905, a Bolshevik conference was held in Tammerfors, Finland. Although the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks formally belonged to one social democratic party, they actually constituted two different parties, each with its own leading center. At this conference, Lenin and Stalin met for the first time. Until then, they had maintained contact by correspondence and through comrades. Of the decisions of the Tammerfors conference, the following two should be noted: one on the restoration of the unity of the party, which had virtually been split into two parties, and the other on the boycott of the First Duma, known as the Wid Duma. As by that time the armed uprising had already begun in Moscow, the conference, on Lenin's advice, hastily completed its work and dispersed to enable the delegates to participate personally in the uprising. But the Tsarist government was not dozing either. It too was preparing for a decisive struggle. Having concluded peace with Japan, and thus lessened the difficulties of its position, the Tsarist government assumed the offensive against the workers and peasants. It declared martial law in a number of provinces where peasant revolts were rife, issued the brutal commands, "Take no prisoners," and "Spare no bullets," and gave orders for the arrest of the leaders of the revolutionary movement and the dispersal of the Soviets of Workers' Deputies. In reply to this, the Moscow Bolsheviks and the Moscow Soviet of Workers' Deputies, which they led, and which was connected with the broad masses of the workers, decided to make immediate preparations for armed uprising. On December 5, 18, the Moscow Bolshevik Committee resolved to call upon the Soviet to declare a general political strike with the object of turning it into an uprising in the course of the struggle. This decision was supported at mass meetings of the workers. The Moscow Soviet responded to the will of the working class and unanimously resolved to start a general political strike. When the Moscow proletariat began the revolt, it had a fighting organization of about 1,000 combatants, more than half of whom were Bolsheviks. In addition, there were fighting squads in several of the Moscow factories. In all, the insurrectionaries had a force of about 2,000 combatants. The workers expected to neutralize the garrison and to win over a part of it to their side. The political strike started in Moscow on December 7, 20. However, efforts to spread it to the whole country failed. It met with inadequate support in St. Petersburg, and this reduced the chances of success of the uprising from the very outset. The Nikolaevskaya, now the October, railway remained in the hands of the Tsarist government. Traffic on this line was not suspended, which enabled the government to transfer regiments of the Guard from St. Petersburg to Moscow for the suppression of the uprising. In Moscow itself, the garrison vacillated. The workers had begun the uprising partly in expectation of receiving support from the garrison. But the revolutionaries had delayed too long, and the government managed to cope with the unrest in the garrison. The first barricades appeared in Moscow on December 9, 22. Soon the streets of the city were covered with barricades. The Tsarist government brought artillery into action. It concentrated a force many times exceeding the strength of the insurrectionaries. For 9 days on end, several thousand armed workers waged a heroic fight. It was only by bringing regiments from St. Petersburg, Tver and the Western Territory that the Tsarist government was able to crush the uprising. On the very eve of the fighting, the leadership of the uprising was partly arrested and partly isolated. The members of the Moscow Bolshevik Committee were arrested. The armed action took the form of disconnected uprisings of separate districts deprived of a directing center and lacking a common plan of operations for the whole city. The districts mainly confined themselves to defensive action. This was the chief source of weakness of the Moscow uprising and one of the causes of its defeat, as Lenin later pointed out. The uprising assumed a particularly stubborn and bitter character in the Krasnaya Presnya district of Moscow. This was the main stronghold and center of the uprising. Here the best of the fighting squads, led by Bolsheviks, were concentrated. But Krasnaya Presnya was suppressed by fire and sword. It was drenched in blood and ablaze with the fires caused by artillery. The Moscow uprising was crushed. The uprising was not confined to Moscow. Revolutionary uprisings broke out in a number of other cities and districts. There were armed uprisings in Krasnoyarsk, Motovlika, Perm, Novorossiysk, Sormovo, Sevastopol and Kronstadt. The oppressed nationalities of Russia also rose in armed struggle. Nearly the whole of Georgia was up in arms. A big uprising took place in the Ukraine, in the cities of Gorlovka, Alexandrovsk and Lugansk, now Voroshilовgrad, in the Donets Basin. A stubborn struggle was waged in Latvia. In Finland the workers formed their Red Guard and rose in revolt. But all these uprisings, like the uprising in Moscow, were crushed with inhuman ferocity by the autocracy. The appraisals of the December armed uprising given by the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks differed. They should not have taken to arms, was the rebuke the Menshevik Plekhanov flung at the party after the uprising. The Mensheviks argued that an uprising was unnecessary and pernicious, that it could be dispensed with in the revolution, that success could be achieved not by armed uprising, but by peaceful methods of struggle. The Bolsheviks branded this stand as treachery. They maintained that the experience of the Moscow armed uprising had but confirmed that the working class could wage a successful armed struggle. In reply to Plekhanov's rebuke, they should not have taken to arms, Lenin said. On the contrary, we should have taken to arms more resolutely, energetically and aggressively. We should have explained to the masses that it was impossible to confine ourselves to a peaceful strike and that a fearless and relentless armed fight was indispensable. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 3, page 348. The uprising of December 1905 was the climax of the revolution. The Tsarist autocracy defeated the uprising. Thereafter the revolution took a turn and began to recede. The tide of revolution gradually subsided. The Tsarist government hastened to take advantage of this defeat to deal the final blow to the revolution. The Tsar's hangmen and jailers began their bloody work. Punitive expeditions raged in Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Transcaucasia and Siberia. But the revolution was not yet crushed. The workers and revolutionary peasants retreated slowly, putting up a fight. New sections of the workers were drawn into the struggle. Over 1 million workers took part in strikes in 1906, 740,000 in 1907. The peasant movement embraced about one-half of the UYEZDS of Tsarist Russia in the first half of 1906, and one-fifth in the second half of the year. Unrest continued in the army and navy. The Tsarist government, in combating the revolution, did not confine itself to repressive measures. Having achieved its first successes by repressive measures, it decided to deal a fresh blow at the revolution by convening a new Duma, a legislative Duma. It hoped in this way to sever the peasants from the revolution and thus put an end to it. In December the Tsarist government promulgated a law providing for the convocation of a new, a legislative Duma as distinct from the old, deliberative, Buligin Duma, which had been swept away as the result of the Bolshevik boycott. The Tsarist election law was of course anti-democratic. Elections were not universal. Over half the population, for example, women and over 2 million workers, were deprived of the right of vote altogether. Elections were not equal. The electorate was divided into 4 curias, as they were called: the agrarian, landlords; the urban, bourgeoisie; the peasant and the worker curias. Election was not direct, but by several stages. There was actually no secret ballot. The election law ensured the overwhelming preponderance in the Duma of a handful of landlords and capitalists over the millions of workers and peasants. The Tsar intended to make use of the Duma to divert the masses from the revolution. In those days, a large proportion of the peasants believed that they could obtain land through the Duma. The constitutional Democrats, Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries deceived workers and peasants by stating that the system the people needed could be obtained without uprising, without revolution. It was to fight this fraud on the people that the Bolsheviks announced and pursued the tactics of boycotting the First State Duma. This was in accordance with the decision passed by the Tammerforsch Conference. In their fight against TSRDM, the workers demanded the unity of the forces of the party, the unification of the party of the proletariat. Armed with the decision of the Tammerforsch Conference on unity, the Bolsheviks supported this demand of the workers and proposed to the Mensheviks that a unity congress of the party be called. Under the pressure of the workers, the Mensheviks had to consent to unification. Lenin was in favor of unification, but only of such unification as would not cover up the differences that existed over the problems of the revolution. Considerable damage was done to the party by the conciliators, Bogdanov, Krasin and others, who tried to prove that no serious differences existed between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Lenin fought the conciliators, insisting that the Bolsheviks should come to the Congress with their own platform, so that the workers might clearly see what the position of the Bolsheviks was and on what basis unification was being effected. The Bolsheviks drew up such a platform and submitted it to the party members for discussion. The Fourth Congress of the RSDLP, known as the Unity Congress, met in Stockholm, Sweden, in April 1906. It was attended by 111 delegates with right of vote, representing 57 local organizations of the party. In addition, there were representatives from the National Social Democratic parties, 3 from the Bund, 3 from the Polish Social Democratic Party, and 3 from the Lettish Social Democratic Organization. Owing to the smash-up of the Bolshevik organizations during and after the December uprising, not all of them were able to send delegates. Moreover, during the Days of Liberty of 1905, the Mensheviks had, from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution, admitted into their ranks a large number of petty bourgeois intellectuals who had nothing whatever in common with revolutionary Marxism. It will suffice to say that the Tiflis Mensheviks, and there were very few industrial workers in Tiflis, sent as many delegates to the Congress as the largest of the proletarian organizations, the St. Petersburg Organization. The result was that at the Stockholm Congress the Mensheviks had a majority, although, it is true, an insignificant one. This composition of the Congress determined the Menshevik character of the decisions on a number of questions. Only formal unity was effected at this Congress. In reality, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks retained their own views and their own independent organizations. The chief questions discussed at the Fourth Congress were the agrarian question, the current situation and the class tasks of the proletariat, policy towards the State Duma, and organizational questions. Although the Mensheviks constituted the majority at this Congress, they were obliged to agree to Lenin's formulation of the first paragraph of the party rules dealing with party membership, in order not to antagonize the workers. On the agrarian question, Lenin advocated the nationalization of the land. He held that the nationalization of the land would be possible only with the victory of the revolution, after TSRDM had been overthrown. Under such circumstances, the nationalization of the land would make it easier for the proletariat, in alliance with the poor peasants, to pass to the socialist revolution. Nationalization of the land meant the confiscation of all the landed estates without compensation and turning them over to the peasantry. The Bolshevik agrarian program called upon the peasants to rise in revolution against the Tsar and the landlords. The Mensheviks took up a different position. They advocated a program of municipalization. According to this program, the landed estates were not to be placed at the disposal of the village communities, not even given to the village communities for use, but were to be placed at the disposal of the municipalities, that is, the local organs of self-government, or zemstvios, and each peasant was to rent as much of this land as he could afford. The Menshevik program of municipalization was one of compromise, and therefore prejudicial to the revolution. It could not mobilize the peasants for a revolutionary struggle and was not designed to achieve the complete abolition of landlord property rights in land. The Menshevik program was designed to stop the revolution halfway. The Mensheviks did not want to rouse the peasants for revolution. The Menshevik program received the majority of the votes at the Congress. The Mensheviks particularly betrayed their anti-proletarian, opportunist nature during the discussion of the resolution on the current situation and on the State Duma. The Menshevik Martinov frankly spoke in opposition to the hegemony of the proletariat in the revolution. Comrade Stalin, replying to the Mensheviks, put the matter very bluntly. Either the hegemony of the proletariat, or the hegemony of the democratic bourgeoisie. That is how the question stands in the party, that is where we differ. As to the State Duma, the Mensheviks extolled it in their resolution as the best means of solving the problems of the revolution and of liberating the people from TSRDM. The Bolsheviks, on the contrary, regarded the Duma as an impotent appendage of TSRDM, as a screen for the evils of TSRdom, which the latter would discard as soon as it proved inconvenient. The Central Committee elected at the Fourth Congress consisted of 3 Bolsheviks and 6 Mensheviks. The editorial board of the central press organ was formed entirely of Mensheviks. It was clear that the internal party struggle would continue. After the Fourth Congress, the conflict between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks broke out with new vigor. In the local organizations, which were formally united, reports on the Congress were often made by 2 speakers, one from the Bolsheviks and another from the Mensheviks. The result of the discussion of the 2 lines was that in most cases the majority of the members of the organization sided with the Bolsheviks. Events proved that the Bolsheviks were right. The Menshevik Central Committee elected at the Fourth Congress increasingly revealed its opportunism and its utter inability to lead the revolutionary struggle of the masses. In the summer and autumn of 1906, the revolutionary struggle of the masses took on new vigor. Sale's revolts broke out in Kronstadt and Svaborg. The peasants' struggle against the landlords flared up. Yet the Menshevik Central Committee issued opportunist slogans, which the masses did not follow. 6. Dispersion of the First State Duma, convocation of the Second State Duma, Fifth Party Congress, dispersion of the Second State Duma, causes of the defeat of the First Russian Revolution. As the First State Duma did not prove docile enough, the Tsarist government dispersed it in the summer of 1906. The government resorted to even more drastic repressions against the people, extended the ravaging activities of the punitive expeditions throughout the country, and announced its decision of shortly calling a Second State Duma. The Tsarist government was obviously growing more insolent. It no longer feared the revolution, for it saw that the revolution was on the decline. The Bolsheviks had to decide whether to participate in the Second Duma or to boycott it. By boycott, the Bolsheviks usually meant an active boycott, and not the mere passive abstention from voting in the elections. The Bolsheviks regarded active boycott as a revolutionary means of warning the people against the attempts of the Tsar to divert them from the path of revolution to the path of Tsarist constitution, as a means of frustrating these attempts and organizing a new onslaught of the people on TSRdom. The experience of the boycott of the Bulygin Duma had shown that a boycott was the only correct tactics, as fully proved by events. Lenin. Selected Works, Volume 3, page 393. This boycott was successful because it not only warned the people against the danger of the path of Tsarist constitutionalism but frustrated the very birth of the Duma. The boycott was successful because it was carried out during the rising tide of the revolution and was supported by this tide, and not when the revolution was receding. The summoning of the Duma could be frustrated only during the high tide of the revolution. The boycott of the Wid Duma, i.e., the First Duma, took place after the December uprising had been defeated, when the Tsar proved to be the victor, that is, at a time when there was reason to believe that the revolution had begun to recede. But, wrote Lenin, it goes without saying that at that time there were as yet no grounds to regard this victory of the Tsar, ed. as a decisive victory. The uprising of December 1905 had its sequel in a series of disconnected and partial military uprisings and strikes in the summer of 1906. The call to boycott the Wid Duma was a call to concentrate these uprisings and make them general. Lenin. Collected Works, Russ. ed. Volume 12, page 20. The boycott of the Wid Duma was unable to frustrate its convocation, although it considerably undermined its prestige and weakened the faith of a part of the population in it. The boycott was unable to frustrate the convocation of the Duma because, as subsequently became clear, it took place at a time when the revolution was receding, when it was on the decline. For this reason, the boycott of the First Duma in 1906 was unsuccessful. In this connection, Lenin wrote in his famous pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder. The Bolshevik boycott of Parliament in 1905 enriched the revolutionary proletariat with highly valuable political experience and showed that in combining legal with illegal, parliamentary with extra-parliamentary forms of struggle, it is sometimes useful and even essential to reject parliamentary forms. The boycott of the Duma by the Bolsheviks in 1906 was, however, a mistake, although a small and easily remediable one. What applies to individuals applies, with necessary modifications, to politics and parties. Not he is wise who makes no mistakes. There are no such men, nor can there be. He is wise who makes not very serious mistakes and who knows how to correct them easily and quickly. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 10, page 74. As to the Second State Duma, Lenin held that in view of the changed situation and the decline of the revolution, the Bolsheviks must reconsider the question of boycotting the State Duma. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 3, page 392. History has shown, Lenin wrote, that when the Duma assembles, opportunities arise for carrying on useful agitation both from within the Duma and, in connection with it, outside. That the tactics of joining forces with the revolutionary peasantry against the constitutional democrats can be applied in the Duma. Ibid. Page 396. All this showed that one had to know not only how to advance resolutely, to advance in the front ranks, when the revolution was in the ascendant, but also how to retreat properly, to be the last to retreat, when the revolution was no longer in the ascendant, changing one's tactics as the situation changed, to retreat not in disorder, but in an organized way, calmly and without panic, utilizing every minute opportunity to withdraw the cadres from under enemy fire, to reform one's ranks, to muster one's forces, and to prepare for a new offensive against the enemy. The Bolsheviks decided to take part in the elections to the Second Duma. But the Bolsheviks did not go to the Duma for the purpose of carrying on organic, legislative work inside it in a bloc with the constitutional Democrats, as the Mensheviks did, but for the purpose of utilizing it as a platform in the interests of the revolution. The Menshevik Central Committee, on the contrary, urged that election agreements be formed with the Constitutional Democrats, and that support be given to the Constitutional Democrats in the Duma, for in their eyes the Duma was a legislative body that was capable of bridling the Tsarist government. The majority of the party organizations expressed themselves against the policy of the Menshevik Central Committee. The Bolsheviks demanded that a new party congress be called. In May 1907, the Fifth Party Congress met in London. At the time of this Congress, the RSDLP, together with the National Social Democratic organizations, had a membership of nearly 150,000. In all, 336 delegates attended the Congress, of whom 105 were Bolsheviks and 97 Mensheviks. The remaining delegates represented the National Social Democratic organizations, the Polish and Lettish Social Democrats, and the Bund, which had been admitted into the RSDLP. At the previous Congress, Trotsky tried to knock together a group of his own at the Congress, a centrist, that is, semi-Menshevik, group, but could get no following. As the Bolsheviks had the support of the Poles and the Lets, they had a stable majority at the Congress. One of the main questions at issue at the Congress was that of policy towards the bourgeois parties. There had already been a struggle between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks on this question at the Second Congress. The Fifth Congress gave a Bolshevik estimate of all the non-proletarian parties, Black Hundreds, Octobrists, Union of October 17th, Constitutional Democrats and Socialist Revolutionaries, and formulated the Bolshevik tactics to be pursued in regard to these parties. The Congress approved the policy of the Bolsheviks and decided to wage a relentless struggle both against the Black Hundred parties, the League of the Russian People, the Monarchists, the Council of the United Nobility, and against the Octobrists, the Commercial and Industrial Party and the Party of Peaceful Renovation. All these parties were outspokenly counter-revolutionary. As regards the liberal bourgeoisie, the Constitutional Democratic Party, the Congress recommended a policy of uncompromising exposure. The false and hypocritical democracy of the Constitutional Democratic Party was to be exposed, and the attempts of the liberal bourgeoisie to gain control of the peasant movement combated. As to the so-called Narodnik or Trudovik parties, the Popular Socialists, the Trudovik Group and the Socialist Revolutionaries, the Congress recommended that their attempts to mask themselves as socialists be exposed. At the same time, the Congress considered it permissible now and then to conclude agreements with these parties for a joint and simultaneous attack on TSRDM and the Constitutional Democratic Bourgeoisie, inasmuch as these parties were at that time democratic parties and expressed the interests of the petty bourgeoisie of town and country. Even before this Congress, the Mensheviks had proposed that a so-called Labor Congress be convened. The Mensheviks' idea was to call a Congress at which Social Democrats, Socialist Revolutionaries and Anarchists should all be represented. This Labor Congress was to form something in the nature of a nonpartisan party, or a broad, petty bourgeois labor party without a program. Lenin exposed this as a pernicious attempt on the part of the Mensheviks to liquidate the Social Democratic Labor Party and to dissolve the vanguard of the working class in the petty bourgeois mass. The Congress vigorously condemned the Menshevik call for a Labor Congress. Special attention was devoted at the Congress to the subject of the trade unions. The Mensheviks advocated neutrality of the trade unions. In other words, they were opposed to the party playing a leading role in them. The Congress rejected the Mensheviks' motion and adopted the resolution submitted by the Bolsheviks. This resolution stated that the party must gain the ideological and political leadership in the trade unions. The Fifth Congress was a big victory for the Bolsheviks in the working class movement. But the Bolsheviks did not allow this to turn their heads, nor did they rest on their laurels. That was not what Lenin taught them. The Bolsheviks knew that more fighting with the Mensheviks was still to come. In an article entitled, Notes of a Delegate, which appeared in 1907, Comrade Stalin assessed the results of the Congress as follows. The actual unification of the advanced workers of all Russia into a single all-Russian party under the banner of revolutionary social democracy. That is the significance of the London Congress, that is its general character. In this article, Comrade Stalin cited data showing the composition of the Congress. They show that the Bolshevik delegates were sent to the Congress chiefly by the big industrial centers, St. Petersburg, Moscow, the Urals, Ivanovo-Voznesensk, etc., whereas the Mensheviks got their mandates from districts where small production prevailed, where artisans, semi-proletarians predominated, as well as from a number of purely rural areas. Obviously, says Comrade Stalin, summing up the results of the Congress, the tactics of the Bolsheviks are the tactics of the proletarians in big industry, the tactics of those areas where the class contradictions are especially clear and the class struggle especially acute. Bolshevism is the tactics of the real proletarians. On the other hand, it is no less obvious that the tactics of the Mensheviks are primarily the tactics of the handicraft workers and the peasant semi-proletarians, the tactics of those areas where the class contradictions are not quite clear and the class struggle is masked. Menshevism is the tactics of the semi-bourgeois elements among the proletariat. So say the figures. Verbatim report of the 5th Congress of the RSDLP, Rus. ed. 1935, pp. She and She. When the Tsar dispersed the first Duma, he expected that the second Duma would be more docile. But the second Duma, too, belied his expectations. The Tsar thereupon decided to disperse it, too, and to convoke a third Duma on a more restricted franchise, in the hope that this Duma would prove more amenable. Shortly after the 5th Congress, the Tsarist government effected what is known as the coup d'état of June 3. On June 3, 1907, the Tsar dispersed the Second State Duma. The 65 deputies of the Social Democratic group in the Duma were arrested and exiled to Siberia. A new election law was promulgated. The rights of the workers and peasants were still further curtailed. The Tsarist government continued its offensive. The Tsar's minister Stolypin intensified the campaign of bloody reprisals against the workers and peasants. Thousands of revolutionary workers and peasants were shot by punitive expeditions or hanged. In the Tsarist dungeons, revolutionaries were tortured mentally and physically. Particularly savage was the persecution of the working-class organizations, especially the Bolsheviks. The Tsar's sleuths were searching for Lenin, who was living in hiding in Finland. They wanted to wreak their vengeance on the leader of the revolution. In December 1907, Lenin managed at great risk to make his way abroad and again became an exile. The dark period of the Stolypin reaction set in. The First Russian Revolution thus ended in defeat. The causes that contributed to this defeat were as follows. 1. In the revolution, there was still no stable alliance of the workers and peasants against TSRDM. The peasants rose in struggle against the landlords and were willing to join in an alliance with the workers against them. But they did not yet realize that the landlords could not be overthrown unless the Tsar were overthrown. They did not realize that the Tsar was acting hand in hand with the landlords, and large numbers of the peasants still had faith in the Tsar and placed their hopes in the Tsarist State Duma. That is why a considerable section of the peasants were disinclined to join in alliance with the workers for the overthrow of TSRDM. The peasants had more faith in the compromising Socialist Revolutionary Party than in the real revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks. As a result, the struggle of the peasants against the landlords was not sufficiently organized. Lenin said, the peasants' actions were too scattered, too unorganized and not sufficiently aggressive, and that was one of the fundamental causes of the defeat of the revolution. Lenin, Collected Works. Rus. ed. Volume 19, page 354. 2. The disinclination of a large section of the peasants to join the workers for the overthrow of TSRDM also influenced the conduct of the army, which largely consisted of peasants' sons clad in soldiers' uniforms. Unrest and revolt broke out in certain units of the Tsar's army, but the majority of the soldiers still assisted the Tsar in suppressing the strikes and uprisings of the workers. 3. Neither was the action of the workers sufficiently concerted. The advanced sections of the working class started a heroic revolutionary struggle in 1905. The more backward sections, the workers in the less industrialized provinces, those who lived in the villages, came into action more slowly. Their participation in the revolutionary struggle became particularly active in 1906, but by then the vanguard of the working class had already been considerably weakened. 4. The working class was the foremost and principal force of the revolution, but the necessary unity and solidarity in the ranks of the party of the working class were lacking. The RSDLP, the party of the working class, was split into two groups, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks pursued a consistent revolutionary line and called upon the workers to overthrow TSRDM. The Mensheviks, by their compromising tactics, hampered the revolution, confused the minds of large numbers of workers and split the working class. Therefore, the workers did not always act concertedly in the revolution, and the working class, still lacking unity within its own ranks, could not become the real leader of the revolution. 5. The Tsarist autocracy received help in crushing the revolution of 1905 from the West European imperialists. The foreign capitalists feared for their investments in Russia and for their huge profits. Moreover, they feared that if the Russian Revolution were to succeed, the workers of other countries would rise in revolution, too. The West European imperialists therefore came to the assistance of the hangman Tsar. The French bankers granted a big loan to the Tsar for the suppression of the revolution. The German Kaiser kept a large army in readiness to intervene in aid of the Russian Tsar. 6. The conclusion of peace with Japan in September 1905 was of considerable help to the Tsar. Defeat in the war and the menacing growth of the revolution had induced the Tsar to hasten the signing of peace. The loss of the war weakened TSRDM. The conclusion of peace strengthened the position of the Tsar. BRIEFSUMMARY. The First Russian Revolution constituted a whole historical stage in the development of our country. This historical stage consisted of two periods. The first period, when the tide of revolution rose from the general political strike in October to the armed uprising in December and took advantage of the weakness of the Tsar, who had suffered defeat on the battlefields of Manchuria, to sweep away the Bulgarian Duma and wrest concession after concession from the Tsar. And the second period, when TSRDM, having recovered after the conclusion of peace with Japan, took advantage of the liberal bourgeoisie's fear of the revolution, took advantage of the vacillation of the peasants, cast them a sop in the form of the Wit Duma, and passed to the offensive against the working class, against the revolution. In the short period of only 3 years of revolution, 1905–07, the working class and the peasantry received a rich political education, such as they could not have received in 30 years of ordinary peaceful development. A few years of revolution made clear what could not be made clear in the course of decades of peaceful development. The revolution disclosed that TSRDM was the sworn enemy of the people, that TSRDM was like the proverbial hunchback whom only the grave could cure. The revolution showed that the liberal bourgeoisie was seeing in from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution alliance with the Tsar and not with the people, that it was a counter-revolutionary force, an agreement with which would be tantamount to a betrayal of the people. The revolution showed that only the working class could be the leader of the bourgeois democratic revolution, that it alone could force aside the liberal constitutional democratic bourgeoisie, destroy its influence over the peasantry, rout the landlords, carry the revolution to its conclusion and clear the way for socialism. Lastly, the revolution showed that the laboring peasantry, despite its vacillations, was the only important force capable of forming an alliance with the working class. Two lines were contending within the RSDLP during the revolution, the line of the Bolsheviks and the line of the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks took as their course the extension of the revolution, the overthrow of TSRDM by armed uprising, the hegemony of the working class, the isolation of the constitutional democratic bourgeoisie, an alliance with the peasantry, the formation of a provisional revolutionary government consisting of representatives of the workers and peasants, the victorious completion of the revolution. The Mensheviks, on the contrary, took as their course the liquidation of the revolution. Instead of overthrowing TSRDM by uprising, they proposed to reform and improve it. Instead of the hegemony of the proletariat, they proposed the hegemony of the liberal bourgeoisie. Instead of an alliance with the peasantry, they proposed an alliance with the constitutional democratic bourgeoisie. Instead of a provisional government, they proposed a state Duma as the center of the revolutionary forces of the country. Thus the Mensheviks sank into the morass of compromise and became vehicles of the bourgeois influence on the working class, virtual agents of the bourgeoisie within the working class. The Bolsheviks proved to be the only revolutionary Marxist force in the party in the country. It was natural that, in view of such profound differences, the RSDLP proved in fact to be split into two parties, the party of the Bolsheviks and the party of the Mensheviks. The Fourth Party Congress changed nothing in the actual state of affairs within the party. It only preserved and somewhat strengthened formal unity in the party. The Fifth Party Congress took a step towards actual unity in the party, a unity achieved under the banner of Bolshevism. Reviewing the revolutionary movement, the Fifth Party Congress condemned the line of the Mensheviks as one of compromise, and approved the Bolshevik line as a revolutionary Marxist line. In doing so, it once more confirmed what had already been confirmed by the whole course of the First Russian Revolution. The revolution showed that the Bolsheviks knew how to advance when the situation demanded it, that they had learned to advance in the front ranks and to lead the whole people in attack. But the revolution also showed that the Bolsheviks knew how to retreat in an orderly way when the situation took an unfavorable turn, when the revolution was on the decline, and that the Bolsheviks had learned to retreat properly, without panic or commotion, so as to preserve their cadres, rally their forces, and, having reformed their ranks in conformity with the new situation, once again to resume the attack on the enemy. It is impossible to defeat the enemy without knowing how to attack properly. It is impossible to avoid utter rout in the event of defeat without knowing how to retreat properly, to retreat without panic and without confusion.